He stood on that platform like he owned the whole state of Wyoming, chest out, thumbs hooked in his vest, grinning at the woman stepping off the train as if she were the punchline of a joke he'd been saving for months. And she was. The moment Evelyn Harper's boot touched the platform, Clayton Marsh spread his arms wide and announced to every soul gathered at Millhaven Station, the merchants, the ranchers, the wives gripping their children's hands, that he had never written a single word of those letters, that a friend had written them on a bet, that no one in their right mind would actually marry a plain, desperate woman who had to advertise herself across state lines just to find a man willing to look at her. Then he laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an embarrassed laugh, the full, open-throated kind, the kind that wanted an audience, that needed one, that didn't stop until the men behind him started laughing too. If you've never found your way to this channel before, now is the time to stay. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single story, and press like if you believe a woman like Evelyn deserved better than what she got that afternoon. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to know how far this story has traveled, and I promise you, what happens next will stay with you long after it's over. The train had been late by nearly 2 hours. Evelyn Harper had spent those 2 hours sitting upright in the last car, her hands folded in her lap, her one good traveling dress smoothed flat against her knees. She had pressed that dress the night before in the boarding house in Cheyenne, where she'd stopped to sleep, and she had used the last of her lavender soap doing it, because she'd told herself she wanted to smell like herself when she met him. Like home. Like something worth keeping. She had the letters in her bag. All 31 of them, bundled in twine she'd bought at the Mercantile back in Hayes. She'd read them so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. She knew which ones made her cry. The one about his mother's apple trees, the one where he described the sound the wind made coming down off the mountains in October, the one where he'd written, plain as anything, that he had stopped believing there was a woman left in this world who understood what quiet men needed until he found her advertisement in the Gazette. She'd kept that letter separate from the others, folded twice and tucked into the inside pocket of her coat, close to her chest, like a kind of proof. 25 years old, and she had sold nearly everything. The rocking chair her father had made, the 2 laying hens, the small iron pot her mother had carried from Ohio. She had sold them one by one, quietly, without telling her neighbor, Mrs. Calhoun, because Mrs. Calhoun would have tried to talk her out of it, and Evelyn was not sure she had the strength to resist being talked out of something if someone tried hard enough. But she had wanted this. She had wanted it badly enough to pack a single trunk, climb aboard a westbound train, and ride for 3 days without sleeping much, watching the land flatten and then buckle and then rise into something wild and enormous that made her feel both terrified and strangely hopeful. Wyoming. She'd said the word to herself softly, like a prayer she wasn't sure she believed in yet. She'd read about the territory in the Gazette. Some of the articles were frightening, some made it sound like the edge of the earth, but the letters from Clayton Marsh had made it sound like somewhere a person could begin again. And that was what she needed. Not rescue, not romance, just the chance to begin again with someone who understood that longing was not the same as weakness. She gathered her bag when the conductor called Millhaven, and she stood up, and she straightened her spine, and she told herself that whatever she felt in her chest right now, the trembling that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite joy, was simply the feeling of her life changing. She had earned the right to be nervous. That was all it was. The platform was more crowded than she expected for a town this size. That was the first thing that struck her as odd. She had pictured a small gathering, maybe a few townspeople, the man she was supposed to meet. But there were easily 30 people standing along the platform, and something in the arrangement of them felt off, too close to the track, too expectant, like they were waiting for something specific to happen and were already half pleased about it. She stepped down, and the sun hit her face, and she raised one hand to shade her eyes. She looked for him the way she'd imagined she would, searching the crowd for a tall man with dark hair going a little gray at the temples, broad shoulders, steady eyes. That was how he described himself, and she had believed it, had pictured it so many times that the image felt almost like a memory. She found him almost immediately. He was easy to spot, not because he matched the description exactly, but because he was already watching her. And something about the way he was watching her made her stomach drop before her brain could fully explain why. Clayton Marsh was handsome, she registered that much. Taller than she'd expected, well-dressed for a frontier town, with a smile already on his face that should have made her feel welcomed. But the smile was wrong. She knew it the way you know a thing in your body before you can put it into language. That smile had an edge. It was the smile of someone holding something back, not emotion, something else. Well, he said loudly, too loudly, stepping forward with his arms opening wide. Here she is. The crowd stirred. Evelyn stopped walking. She did not know why she stopped. She only knew that her feet refused to carry her any further toward that smile. Clayton Marsh, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. That's right. He was still grinning. He glanced over his shoulder at the men behind him. 3 of them, she counted, all grinning too, all watching him the way men watch a friend who's about to do something they've agreed to find hilarious. And you must be the woman who answered my advertisement. I wrote to you, she said carefully. You wrote back. I did. He paused, and the pause was too deliberate, too comfortable. He was enjoying something. She could feel it. Well, someone did. The crowd went quiet in a particular way. The way crowds go quiet when they already know what's coming and are deciding whether to be complicit in it. Evelyn felt cold. What does that mean? She asked. Clayton Marsh spread his hands wide, like a man presenting a trick, and he told her. Told her all of it, right there on the platform in the afternoon sun, in front of every soul in Millhaven who'd chosen to come out and witness the entertainment. That a friend had written the letters on a bet. That they'd wanted to see if a lonely woman from Kansas would actually be desperate enough to board a train and come west chasing words some salesman had composed over whiskey on a slow Tuesday night. That there was no apple tree. There was no October wind off the mountains he had described, because he had never described anything. He had barely read the letters his friend had written on his behalf, had just signed his name at the bottom and collected the $10 the bet had paid out when Evelyn's first reply arrived. He laughed when he finished. And then the men behind him laughed. And then, God help them, a few people in the crowd laughed, the uncomfortable laugh of people who weren't sure they should be laughing but didn't know what else to do with their faces. Evelyn stood completely still. She had 31 letters in her bag. She had lavender soap on her dress. She had sold her father's rocking chair. Ze became aware, in that strange crystalline way that extreme humiliation sometimes produces, of every detail around her simultaneously. The sound of the train still hissing behind her, the smell of coal smoke, a child tugging at a woman's sleeve 2 feet away, the scratch of her collar against her neck, the weight of her trunk being unloaded from the baggage car by a porter who had not yet understood what he was unloading it into. She did not cry. She wanted to. The pressure of it was enormous, a wave that rose fast and threatened everything. But something in her, some part of her she had not fully known was there until this exact moment, locked down against it. She was not going to cry in front of this man. She was not going to give him that. She had already given him 3 days on a train and everything she owned. He was not getting her tears on top of it. Are you finished? She asked. The laughter sputtered. Clayton Marsh blinked. He had not expected that. She could see it. The slight recalibration in his eyes, the way his grin shifted into something less certain. I'm sorry, he said. I asked if you were finished. Her voice was completely flat. Not cold exactly, just stripped of everything. Because if you are, I'd like to know where the nearest respectable boarding house is, and I'd appreciate someone telling me without laughing about it. Someone in the crowd, a woman, older, standing near the far edge, made a sound that might have been respect. Clayton's jaw tightened. He hadn't gotten the reaction he wanted. He'd wanted tears, or rage, or humiliated scrambling. He'd wanted a scene that confirmed his version of her, desperate, foolish, easy to break. What he was getting instead was something quieter and therefore, somehow, more threatening. Lady, he started. Don't. The word came out sharper than she intended. Don't call me lady in that tone. My name is Evelyn Harper, and I've just spent 3 days on a train because I was foolish enough to believe that a man who wrote about his mother's apple trees might actually be a man worth knowing. That's my mistake. I'll own it. But what you just did... She stopped, because her voice was, despite everything, beginning to fray at the edges, and she refused to let it. She breathed once, hard, through her nose. What you just did was cruel, and everyone standing on this platform knows it. The silence that followed was different from the laughing silence. This one had weight. Clayton's face shifted into something uglier. The performance had been pulled out from under him, and he didn't like it. You'd best be careful, sweetheart. That's enough. The voice came from somewhere to Evelyn's left. Not loud, not theatrical, just placed there, in the space where the wrong thing was about to happen, with the kind of certainty that stops things. She turned. She hadn't noticed him before, and she didn't know why, because once she saw him, it seemed impossible that she'd missed him. He was standing maybe 10 feet from her, slightly apart from the crowd, with the posture of a man who had not come to this platform for entertainment, but had ended up witnessing it anyway and was now deciding what to do about that. Medium height, broad through the shoulders, a worn hat that had seen better weather, dark eyes that were directed at Clayton Marsh with an expression that was not anger exactly. Something quieter than anger and considerably more serious. "Gideon Blackwood," someone near her murmured. Clayton stiffened. "This ain't your business, Blackwood. You're making a woman stand in public while you laugh at her." Gideon Blackwood's voice was unhurried and precise. "In my experience, that becomes other people's business whether you want it to or not. She came out here on her own. I know why she came out here." He stepped forward, not aggressively, but with the steady momentum of a man who had decided to move and was not particularly interested in what came next. "She came out here because she trusted somebody who wasn't worth trusting." He stopped when he was close enough that Clayton had to look up slightly to maintain eye contact. "That's on you, not her." The two men looked at each other. Evelyn watched something pass between them. Not friendship, not any kind of history she could immediately read, but some mutual recognition of where this particular moment stood. Clayton wanted to push. He was angry enough to push. But something in the way Gideon Blackwood was standing, the complete lack of performance in it, no bravado, no posturing, just a man occupying a piece of ground with absolute conviction, made pushing seem like a poor choice. Clayton looked at his men. One of them shrugged almost imperceptibly. "Keep your charity projects to yourself, Blackwood," Clayton said. He made it sound dismissive, but there was retreat under it. Gideon didn't answer. He just turned, and he looked at Evelyn, and the look was straightforward and devoid of pity, which was, she realized with sudden fierce clarity, exactly what she needed. "Miss Harper," he said, "I've got a ranch about 4 miles out. There's a room that's not being used. You're welcome to stay until you figure out your next step, if you want it." Evelyn stared at him. Around them, the crowd was watching with a new kind of attention now. Not the ugly entertainment of before, something more complicated. "You don't know me," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I know what just happened to you, and I know you didn't deserve it." He paused. "It's just a room, no conditions attached." She looked at him for a long moment. Every sensible instinct she had said that accepting a stranger's offer in a town she didn't know was precisely the kind of decision a desperate woman made when she'd stopped thinking clearly. She knew that. She had always prided herself on thinking clearly. But she also had $4 left in her purse. She had no ticket home. She had nowhere in this territory that she knew, and the only person she'd known by name had just used her humiliation as public entertainment. "All right," she said. He nodded once, as if this were a reasonable outcome. He picked up her trunk, one-handed, like it weighed nothing, and started toward the edge of the platform. Evelyn picked up her bag and followed him. She did not look at Clayton Marsh as she passed him. She did not look at the crowd. She kept her eyes forward and her spine straight and her face composed, and she walked, and each step felt like she was moving away from one version of her life and towards something she could not yet see clearly enough to name. Behind her, she heard Clayton's voice, loud enough to carry, "Don't come crying back when he gets tired of charity, sweetheart." She kept walking. At the edge of the platform, she heard the older woman's voice again, the one who had made that sound earlier, that sound that might have been respect. The woman said, clearly and without particular drama, "Clayton Marsh, your mother would be ashamed of you today." There was another silence. Evelyn allowed herself one small breath of something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was in the same neighborhood. She followed Gideon Blackwood to a wagon that was neither impressive nor neglected, just a working vehicle, practical and honest, exactly what a 4-mile ranch road required. He loaded her trunk with the same uncomplicated efficiency he'd shown on the platform, then came around and offered a hand up without a word. She took it. His hand was rough and calloused and warm, and he let go the moment she was settled. He climbed up on the other side and clicked the horses forward. They rode in silence for a while. Not an uncomfortable silence, at least not on his end. On her end, it was complicated. She was still managing the aftershocks of the last 20 minutes, The way extreme experiences sometimes hit you in waves after the moment has passed, and she was working very hard on not shaking visibly. "You don't have to talk," he said without looking at her. "You don't have to explain anything. I just thought you should know that." She looked at him sideways. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that went considerably past the words. He nodded. The horses moved. The town fell away behind them. She looked out at the land ahead. It was enormous, which she had expected, and raw, which she had expected, and startlingly beautiful in a way she had not quite expected. Not beautiful like the river country of Kansas that she'd grown up with. Not gentle and domesticated, but something fiercer and more demanding, like a place that had opinions about who belonged to it and would take its time deciding about you. "The ranch?" she started. "Nothing fancy," he said. "I'll warn you now so you're not surprised. It's clean and it's solid, and that's about what I can say for it." "I don't need fancy," she said, and then paused, because it sounded like something a person said to seem agreeable. And she didn't want to sound like that. She was so tired of performing agreeableness. "I mean that. I grew up working." He glanced at her then, a brief, assessing look that wasn't unkind. "What kind of work?" "Farm work, mostly. My father's place. After he passed, I stayed on and managed it for 3 years until the bank decided the title was complicated." She kept her voice level. "Which is the long way of saying I know how to work and I'm not afraid of dirt." "Good," he said simply. Something about that one word, not effusive, not surprised, just good, like a statement of fact, settled something in her chest that had been braced for a long time. They rode on. The road curved up through low hills, and she could see, in the distance, the shapes of mountains so large they seemed almost theoretical. She had never seen mountains like that. She had read about them. Seeing them was entirely different. "Those mountains," she said before she meant to say anything at all. "Bighorns," he said. "They take some getting used to." "How long did it take you?" He considered that. "Still working on it," he said. She almost smiled. She wasn't ready to smile yet, not fully, but the muscles of it were remembering they existed. The ranch appeared around a bend in the road. Not suddenly, but gradually, the way real things appear, piece by piece. First the fence line, weathered but sound. Then a barn that was bigger than she expected, functional and well kept. Then the house itself, which was exactly what he'd said, nothing fancy. A solid, square, 2-story structure that had clearly been built by someone who understood what weather would be asked of it. She looked at it and thought, someone worked hard here, that's visible. Gideon pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. He went around to her side. "There's someone you should know is in the house," he said. "My neighbor, Mrs. Olson. She was helping me with some mending today. I should tell you before you walk in, because she's direct." "Direct how?" "She'll have an opinion about all of this," he said. "She's going to have it loudly." "About me staying here?" "About everything," he said, with what might have been, under better circumstances, a hint of dry humor. Evelyn climbed down without taking the offered hand this time, not because she was being difficult, but because her legs needed to do something on their own, and followed him toward the front door. It opened before they reached it. The woman standing in the doorway was perhaps 60, with gray-streaked hair pulled back and eyes that moved from Gideon to Evelyn to the trunk, with the efficiency of someone who had already been watching from the window and had already formed her initial assessments. "Gideon Marsh," she said his name like a punctuation mark. "Mrs. Olson." "I heard what happened in town." She looked at Evelyn with an expression that was not soft, but was not without warmth, the way a woman's face looks when she is reserving judgment, while everything about the situation is already making her angry on another person's behalf. "You're the young woman from Kansas." "Evelyn Harper," Evelyn said. "I know your name. The whole town's going to know your name by supper." Mrs. Olson stepped back from the doorway. "Come inside. You need food, and I suspect you need somewhere to sit down that isn't a train or a wagon." Evelyn walked in. The house was warmer than she expected and smelled of something on the stove, something simple and savory, whatever Mrs. Olson had been cooking while mending, apparently, and the main room was sparse but ordered, the kind of room that spoke of a man who kept things tidy without particularly caring about decoration. "Sit," Mrs. Olson said, pointing to the table. Evelyn sat. Mrs. Olson put a cup of coffee in front of her without asking whether she wanted it. Evelyn wrapped both hands around it. "Clayton Marsh is a fool," Mrs. Olson said, settling herself across the table with the air of someone who has been waiting to say that for longer than today. He's always been a fool. His father had more sense in one boot than that boy has in his entire head, and I told his mother as much when he was 17 and she didn't listen either. You know him well? Evelyn asked. Small town, Mrs. Olson said. We know everyone, whether we want to or not. She looked at Evelyn with those direct eyes. You doing all right? The question, simple, direct, with no performance attached to it, did something unexpected to Evelyn's composure. She had been holding herself so carefully since the platform that she had almost forgotten it was an act of holding. The question poked at the seam of it. Yes, she said. I will be. That's a different thing from all right, Mrs. Olson said. Evelyn looked at her coffee. Yes, she said quietly. It is. A small silence. From somewhere outside, she could hear Gideon moving around. The sounds of a man tending to horses, practical and purposeful, familiar sounds she recognized from her father's farm that were now somehow both comforting and heartbreaking. What are you going to do? Mrs. Olson asked. I don't know yet, Evelyn admitted. I've got $4 and no ticket home and nothing to go back to that's better than this. She heard the bleakness of that as she said it and felt the need to correct it. I don't mean this as charity. I'll work. Whatever's needed. I can cook, I can sew, I can manage a kitchen garden, and I'm not afraid of outdoor work. I just need... She stopped. Time, Mrs. Olson said. Time, Evelyn agreed, and somewhere to be while I figure out what comes next. Mrs. Olson studied her for a moment with the measuring look of a woman who has watched a great many people in her life and developed strong opinions about which ones were worth the trouble. You know what that man out there did today, she said, meaning Gideon. You understand that a lot of men wouldn't have done that. I know, Evelyn said. I'm not taking it lightly. Good, Mrs. Olson said. The same word Gideon had used, with the same quality of plain meaning. Because he's a good man who doesn't advertise it, which in my experience means more than a man who makes sure everyone knows how good he is. The door opened and Gideon came in, stamping mud from his boots in the doorway with the automatic care of a man who lived alone and cleaned his own floors. Horses are settled, he said. I thought I'd show Miss Harper the room, give her a chance to get settled before supper, if that's all right with you. He said the last part to Evelyn, not to Mrs. Olson, and something in that, in the deliberateness of it, in the way he included her in the decision about her own situation, registered. Yes, she said. Thank you. The room was on the ground floor at the back of the house, small and plain, with a single window that faced the barn and the mountains beyond, a narrow bed with a clean quilt on it, and a chest of drawers that was empty. He set her trunk beside the door and stepped back into the hallway. It's not much, he said. It's more than I had 2 hours ago, she said. He looked at her then, and this time the look lasted a beat longer than his other looks had, and she had the uncomfortable sensation of being seen clearly, which was strange because she was usually the person doing the seeing clearly, she was usually the composed one, the observer. I want to say something, he said, and I don't know exactly how to say it without sounding... He paused, working for the word. Without sounding like I have an angle. Say it anyway, she said. He leaned against the doorframe, looked at the floor, then back at her. What Clayton did today is going to spread through this town in a specific way. And some of it is going to be ugly in a way that's not fair to you. People are going to have opinions. Some of them you'll hear about, and some of them you won't. He paused. I just want you to know that my opinion isn't one of the ones you need to worry about. I know what I saw on that platform, and I know what it means. That's all. She looked at him for a moment. Are you telling me that so I won't feel judged? She asked. Yes, he said, without apology. That's... She looked for the right word, struggled. That's a kind thing to say? It's just a true thing, he said, and he went back toward the main room. Evelyn stood alone in the small room with the window facing the barn and the mountains, and she pressed both hands flat against the surface of the chest of drawers and breathed, slowly, until the wave she'd been holding back since the platform began, finally, in private, to pass through her. She did not sob. There was one long moment where everything in her tightened and crested, and then she breathed through it, and it moved past, and she was left on the other side of it feeling hollowed out and strangely lighter, the way you feel after a fever breaks. She looked out the window at the mountains. They were going pink at their edges now as the sun shifted. She looked at them until they stopped feeling theoretical. Then she unpacked her dress and hung it on the hook behind the door, and she put her letters at the bottom of the trunk under everything else, and she straightened the quilt on the bed, and she washed her face in the basin on the chest of drawers with the water that was already there. Cold water, but clean. And she went back out to the main room where Mrs. Olson was putting food on the table and Gideon was setting out plates with the quiet economy of someone who had done it alone too many times. And she sat down, and she said that the food smelled good, and she meant it, and that was the first night. It was not easy, it was not peaceful, not fully, because her mind kept running back to the platform the way a tongue finds a sore tooth, kept replaying Clayton's laugh, the sound of the crowd, her own voice saying, "Are you finished?" in a tone she hadn't known she possessed. She lay awake for a long time in the narrow bed under the clean quilt and stared at the window where the mountains had gone dark and the stars had come out in a quantity she had never seen before because she had never been anywhere dark enough to see them. She thought, "I don't know what this place is yet." She thought, "But I'm still here." And somehow, in the wreckage of everything she had come west believing she was walking toward, that felt like enough to hold on to. She was still here. She had not broken on that platform. She had not run. She had said, "Are you finished?" to a man who expected her to collapse, and she had walked away, and she had sat at a stranger's table and eaten food without apology, and tomorrow would be the first day she woke up in Wyoming. Whatever that turned out to mean. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind came down off the bighorns in the dark, and moved through the grass and over the fence line, and past the barn, and against the window glass, and it sounded like exactly what the letter had described it as, and she hated that, and she breathed through that too. Then she slept. She woke up before the sun. Not gradually, the way she used to wake up back in Kansas when the light came in soft and slow through the muslin curtains of her father's house. This was immediate, eyes open, body alert, the unfamiliar ceiling above her registering as wrong before her brain had fully assembled where she was and why. Then it came back. All of it. She lay still for a moment and let it settle over her like a weight that she would have to pick up and carry again today, and every day after that, for some indeterminate amount of time. The platform. Clayton's voice, the sound of the laughter, the cold ground under her feet when she'd walked away from it. She let herself feel the full shape of it, because she had learned in the years after her father died and the bank came for the title and all the small disasters that had preceded this large one, that the worst thing you could do with a bad feeling was pretend it wasn't there. You had to look at it directly, name it, then put it somewhere manageable. So she named it. Betrayal, humiliation, fear about what came next. And underneath all of that, quieter but still there, something she didn't have a word for yet. Something about walking into that stranger's house last night and being given food and a room and not a single question she wasn't ready to answer. She'd deal with the feeling without a name later. She got up. The cold hit her immediately. Sharp, dry cold that was different from Kansas cold, drier, with less weight to it but somehow more insistent. She dressed quickly and pulled her hair back and folded the quilt and placed it at the foot of the bed out of pure habit, the way her mother had taught her. Because you didn't leave a borrowed room looking like you didn't care whose room it was. When she came out into the main room, Gideon was already there. He was at the stove with his back to her, and he startled slightly when he heard her footsteps, which surprised her. She hadn't expected him to startle. "Morning," he said, without turning. "Morning. Coffee's ready. I was going to start on the horses, but I figured—" He paused, clearly deciding how to phrase something. "I figured you might be up early. Some people are. After a day like yesterday." She came to the stove and poured herself a cup without being invited, which she did deliberately, because she had already decided that the worst thing she could do in this house was act like a guest who needed permission to exist in it. "Some people can't sleep at all," she said. "I slept. I'm grateful for that." He glanced at her sideways, a quick look, then away. "Hungry? I can make something." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She set her cup down and looked at him levelly. "Mr. Blackwood, I need to be useful. I'm not built to sit and be taken care of. If that's going to be a problem for the arrangement we have, we should talk about it now rather than later." He looked at her for a longer moment this time, and she couldn't quite read the expression, but it wasn't irritation. It was closer to assessment. The same quality of attention he'd had on the platform. like a man who listened to what was actually being said rather than what he expected to hear. "What arrangement do you think we have?" he asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. "You offered me a room until I figure out my next step," she said. "I accepted. That means I'm here on temporary terms, and I don't intend to take more than I give while those terms are in effect. So, do you want breakfast or not?" He considered her for one more beat. Then, "There's salt pork in the cold cellar and eggs in the barn." "I'll find them," she said. The cold cellar was exactly where she thought it would be based on the layout of the house, and the eggs were where a farm woman would expect them to be based on decades of chicken logic, and she made breakfast without ceremony, and they ate it at the table in the early light, and neither of them spoke much, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was simply two people eating. She noticed things about him in those small morning interactions that she stored without quite meaning to. He drank his coffee black and finished it in 3 long swallows. He ate without complaint, and without the excessive appreciation that men sometimes offered when they wanted a woman to feel obligated. He pushed back from the table and said thank you once, plainly, and meant it, and then he went outside to start his day and left her to determine the shape of hers. Mrs. Olson arrived mid-morning, which Evelyn was beginning to understand was a regular occurrence. The older woman came through the door with a basket over one arm and the expression of someone who had decided something overnight. "I told 3 people this morning," she announced, setting her basket on the table, "that you're a sensible woman who is badly treated and that anyone who says otherwise is going to have a conversation with me about it." Evelyn looked up from the windowsill she was cleaning. She'd found a rag and started on the main room's windows because they needed it and because standing still made her anxious. "I didn't ask you to do that." "I know." Mrs. Olson began unpacking her basket with efficient movements. "I did it because it was the right thing to do, and also because I'm 62 years old, and I've stopped waiting for someone to ask me to do right things. I just do them." She paused and looked at Evelyn appraisingly. "You're cleaning his windows." "They needed it." "They've needed it for 6 months," Mrs. Olson said, with a tone that communicated an entire history of failed suggestions. "He's a good man, but he doesn't see dust unless it actually moves." "He sees what matters to him," Evelyn said, and then caught herself, because that had come out sounding like a defense, and she'd had no intention of defending Gideon Blackwood. She barely knew him. Mrs. Olson smiled at the basket, where Evelyn couldn't see it. In those first weeks, Evelyn built a structure for herself the only way she knew how. Through work. Not to prove herself, not at first, though that became part of it later. At first it was simply survival mechanics. She needed to be doing something, or her mind went back to the platform, went back to the letters in the trunk, went back to the specific quality of Clayton's laugh, and she could not afford that. She had to keep moving. She reorganized the kitchen, which had the practical logic of a man who cooked for function rather than pleasure. Everything in reach, nothing wasted, but no particular system beyond that. She introduced a system. She didn't ask permission, she did it. And when Gideon came in for supper the first night, he looked at the reorganized shelves for a long moment without speaking, and she braced herself, and then he said, "Huh, that's better," and opened the tin she'd moved to exactly where his hand expected it to be, and she felt an absurd satisfaction at that small thing. The vegetable garden behind the house was a source of genuine grief. She found it on the 3rd day when she went around the back of the house looking for where the water barrel was, and she stopped in front of what had obviously once been a serious garden. She could tell by the size of the fenced plot, the arrangement of the beds, and was now a tangle of gone-to-seed plants, encroaching weeds, and a fence that had lost 2 posts to what looked like a bad winter. She stood there looking at it for several minutes. "That was my wife's," Gideon said behind her. She turned around. He was standing a few feet back, and he hadn't made a sound approaching, which startled her more than the statement did. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be." He looked at the garden, not at her. His voice was level, but there was something in it that caused him to keep level. "She died 3 years ago. Fever. It came fast." He paused. I didn't do anything with it after that. The garden. I just left it." Evelyn looked back at the overgrown beds. "Would you mind if I worked on it?" she asked. "I'd understand if you'd rather I left it." He was quiet for a moment. She waited. "It's a waste of good ground," he said finally. "She'd have said the same." That was all. He went back to the fence he'd been mending. Evelyn stood with the weight of the information he'd given her and understood that it had not been easy for him to give it, and that it explained a few things about the quality of silence in this house. The particular silence of a man who had gotten used to being alone, not by preference, but by the terrible logic of loss. She started on the garden the next morning. It was hard work, the kind of work that is almost entirely unglamorous, pulling root systems that had 3 years to entrench themselves, digging up compacted soil that hadn't been turned in seasons, fixing the fence posts with materials she found in the barn. She came in at the end of the first day with dirt under every fingernail and a new pain across her lower back, and she sat down at the table and did not move for 10 minutes. Gideon put a cup of coffee in front of her without comment. "Thank you," she said. "Saw what you did out there," he said, sitting down across from her with his own cup. "That's going to take a while." "I know. You don't have to." "If you say I don't have to do something one more time," she said, without heat, "I'm going to start throwing things." He almost smiled at that. She caught the edges of it before he looked down at his coffee. "Fair enough," he said. Town was another matter. She had to go eventually. She needed thread, and she'd found that the house was low on several dry goods, and she would not ask Gideon to fetch things on her behalf when she was capable of fetching them herself. So she went, 2 weeks after the platform, on a Tuesday when the road was dry enough to make the walk manageable. She felt them before she saw them. The looks. Not all bad. Some of them were simply curious, the way small towns are curious about unfamiliar faces. But some were of the other kind, the assessing kind, the kind that were measuring what they'd heard about her against what they were seeing. She had rehearsed for this, in a way. She held her head at the angle she'd learned on the platform, not defiant, which read as afraid, but simply direct. The angle that said she was aware of being watched and found it unremarkable. The mercantile was run by a man named Hofstetter, who had small eyes and a capacious memory for gossip, and who asked, as she set her purchases on the counter, whether she was settling in all right out at Blackwood's place. The question was designed to imply a number of things. "I'm renting a room," she said, with the mild emphasis that made clear she'd heard the implication and was declining to engage with it. "And yes, thank you." She paid for her goods and picked up her basket. On her way out, she nearly walked directly into a woman who was coming in. A young woman, or near enough, perhaps 20, with pretty dark hair and the look of someone who had grown up pretty and wasn't entirely sure what to do with that now that she was of an age where it created expectations. She looked at Evelyn with a flash of something. Not hostility, something more complicated, something like recognition, mixed with pity, mixed with something she was working to suppress. "Miss Harper," the woman said. "I'm Ruth Calloway. My father has the land east of Mr. Blackwood's." She stopped. She seemed to be deciding something. Then, "I just wanted to say that what happened at the station was awful. I was there, and I'm ashamed I didn't say anything." Evelyn looked at her. "You didn't have to say anything. It wasn't your responsibility." Still, Ruth Calloway seemed to mean this sincerely. It wasn't right. Clayton Marsh has always been. He's not a good man. Most people know that and don't say it because his family has money. "I know that now," Evelyn said. There was a pause that might have been awkward, but didn't quite become one. "If you need anything," Ruth said, "while you're getting settled, someone to show you where things are in town, or—" She stopped, seemed to realize she was overstepping in her rush to be useful. "I'm sorry, you probably don't need—" "I would like that," Evelyn said, and Ruth's expression shifted into something genuinely pleased. That was how she found her first real foothold in Mill Haven. Not through grand gestures or dramatic turnarounds, but through a collision in a mercantile doorway and a young woman's belated attempt to make right what she'd witnessed. The weeks turned. October arrived, and with it a cold that was entirely different from September's cold. This one had conviction. The mornings were brutal, and the evenings closed in early, and the work of the ranch shifted accordingly. Gideon began longer days, checking fence lines before the winter made it harder, arranging the feed stores, managing the cattle with an attention that bordered on obsessive, and that she recognized, over time, as love. Not sentimental love, practical love, the kind a man had for work that was also a calling, work that connected him to something larger than his immediate circumstances. She watched him work sometimes. Not for long, and not in a way she'd have admitted to watching, but it was hard not to notice the quality of his attention when he was in the barn or moving through the pastures. He was careful. He was slow when careful was what was needed, and fast when speed was required, and he never confused the two. She had met men who were impressive in the way that wanted witnesses, and she had met men who were capable in the way that didn't require any, and Gideon Blackwood was clearly the second kind. On a cold Tuesday evening in mid-October, they had their first real fight. It started with a small thing, the way real fights usually do. She'd rearranged the supply order that he'd left on the kitchen table. She'd added to it, corrected a quantity she thought was too low for the winter stores they'd need, and changed the order of the list because the way he'd written it would mean 2 trips to different ends of town when one organized trip would serve. She'd done it without asking because she'd thought it was simply a practical improvement. He came in at supper, saw the list, and went very still. "Did you change this?" he asked. "I adjusted a few things. The flour quantity was going to leave you short by February, and I've been ordering my own supplies for 6 years," he said, and his voice was quiet, which she was learning was actually the warning register, not loudness. "I know what I need. I know you didn't ask for my input." She kept her own voice steady. "But I know something about winter stores, and I thought—" "You thought?" He set the list down. "Miss Harper, I appreciate everything you've done in this house. I mean that. But this is my ranch, my order, my decision." The room went tight. She stood there for a moment and made herself count to 3 before she said anything, because what she wanted to say in the first second was considerably less useful than what she needed to say. "You're right," she said. "It's your ranch, and I overstepped. But the flour quantity is genuinely going to be a problem." He looked at her, a long, complicated look. "How short?" he said finally. 2 weeks, maybe 3, if the winter runs long." He picked up the list again, looked at what she'd changed. He did not apologize. She hadn't exactly expected him to, but after a moment he put the list back down and said, "The rest of it stays how I had it." "Fine," she said. "The flour—" He stopped. Started again. "The flour makes sense." She turned back to the stove. They ate supper with the particular tension of 2 people who have established that they are each capable of holding their ground, which was uncomfortable and also, she thought, necessary. She did not want to live in a place where she had to be smaller than she was. She did not think she was going to have to, but both of them needed to know where the edges were. That night, she sat by the fire after supper with one of the books she'd found on the single shelf in the main room. A battered almanac that she was reading not for information, but for the comfort of words on a page, the way she'd always read when she needed something to do with her mind. And Gideon sat across from her with the ranch accounts he always worked in the evenings, and after a long stretch of silence, he said, without looking up from his ledger, "My wife used to change my supply orders, too." Evelyn looked up from the almanac. "She said I always underestimated January," he continued, still not looking up, his voice so careful it cost him something. "Said I was optimistic about how long things lasted." "Were you?" "Yes." He turned the page. "Every year." The fire popped. Somewhere outside, the wind had picked up, the same wind she'd heard on her first night, the one that came down off the mountains. "I'll ask before I change anything," she said. "You don't have to ask," he said. "You can just tell me what you think. I'll decide, but you can tell me." She looked at him for a moment. This man who had spoken more personal words just now than she'd heard from him in weeks, who had offered the information about his dead wife like a kind of peace treaty, awkward and careful and real. "All right," she said. He nodded and went back to his ledger. She went back to her almanac. But later, lying in her room in the dark, she thought about a man who had been wrong about January every year, and had a wife who told him so, and she thought about what it meant that he'd chosen to tell her that tonight. And she did not know exactly what it meant, but she was honest enough with herself to know that it meant something. The garden, meanwhile, was showing the first signs of actual recovery. She'd cleared the beds entirely and turned the soil and rebuilt the fence with posts she'd found in the barn and help she hadn't asked for but received anyway. One Saturday morning when Gideon appeared beside her with a post-hole digger and simply began digging without comment. They'd worked side by side for 3 hours without speaking much, and the fence had gotten done, and then he'd gone back to his other work and she'd gone back to hers, and nothing had been said about it. Mrs. Olson came by one afternoon to inspect the progress and stood at the garden fence with her arms folded and an expression that might, if you looked at it from certain angles, be called approval. She's going to have garlic in the ground before frost, Mrs. Olson said to Gideon, who was standing nearby tending to a piece of harness. Seems like it, he said. His wife used to get garlic in by the first week of October, Mrs. Olson said, as if Evelyn weren't standing right there. Evelyn's going to make it by the 15th if she keeps at it. Mrs. Olson, Evelyn said pleasantly. Yes? I can hear you. I know, the older woman said. I'm talking to Gideon, not you. Evelyn looked at Gideon. He was studying the harness with great concentration. Helpful, she said, to no one in particular. I try, said Mrs. Olson. November brought the first real snow, and with it a confinement that changed the texture of everything. The ranch contracted. The work that could be done outdoors decreased, the distances became harder, and the two of them ended up in the house together more than had been true in the easier months. She learned his habits in the close quarters of long winter evenings. He didn't sleep much, rose before anyone had a right to be awake, and spent the hours before the household stirred in the main room with his accounts, or sometimes just with his coffee, staring at nothing in particular. She started coming out earlier, too, for the coffee if nothing else, and those early mornings before the day fully asserted itself became the times they talked most. Not about important things at first, about the ranch, about the cattle, about what needed doing and what could wait, about the best way to get the wood stove to hold heat through the night, which she had opinions about, and so did he. And they were not exactly the same opinions, which they argued about pleasantly over several evenings before arriving at a compromise that worked better than either of their original approaches. But then, gradually, other things. One morning she told him about her father, not the death, but the man himself, the way he'd moved through a farm, the way he'd talked to horses in a voice he never used with people, the particular expression he'd gotten when a season came in right after he'd worried it wouldn't. Gideon listened without interrupting. Then he told her about coming to Wyoming 12 years ago with $80 and a horse and no particularly clear plan, and how that had seemed reasonable to him at 23 in a way that had seemed progressively less reasonable as he got older, but it ultimately worked out well enough that he'd never had to fully confront how foolish it had actually been. She laughed at that. A real laugh. The first real one she'd had in weeks, that surprised her when it came out. He looked at her when she laughed, and he looked away quickly after, but not before she'd seen the expression on his face, which was the expression of a man who had heard a sound he hadn't heard in a long time and had not been prepared for how it would land. That was the thing she didn't let herself think about too directly, because she was aware of it, had been aware of it in some peripheral way since the night with the almanac and the supply list, had been aware of the particular atmosphere of the early mornings and the long evenings, had been aware of the way she sometimes caught herself noticing the most ordinary things about him, the way he held a coffee cup, the way he pulled his hat down when the wind came from the north, the way he said fair enough instead of arguing past the point of usefulness. She was aware of all of it, and she was also aware that she was a woman who had traveled west on the strength of 31 letters from a man she'd never met, a man who had turned those letters into a public joke at her expense, and that the part of her that evaluated men and their words and their intentions had been profoundly and recently wrong in ways she was still recovering from. So she noticed, and she did not act on the noticing, and she told herself this was wisdom rather than fear, and she was mostly convinced. And then Clayton Marsh came back. Not to the ranch, not yet. First he came back as a rumor. Mrs. Olson brought it one afternoon in December, along with a pie and the particular expression of someone carrying news they wished they didn't have. He's telling people, she said, setting the pie down and sitting without being invited, which was her way, that you're staying at Gideon's ranch because you're desperate and you'll settle for anything, that you came west looking for a man and you found one who felt sorry for you. Evelyn kept her hands flat on the table. I see. He's also saying, Mrs. Olson paused in the particular way of someone deciding how much to say. He's saying that Gideon is a fool who doesn't know he's being taken advantage of. Gideon knows exactly what the arrangement is, Evelyn said. I know that. You know that. Mrs. Olson looked at her steadily. Clayton is saying it because he wants to make trouble. He doesn't like that you didn't break the way he expected. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The fire in the wood stove was doing what they'd figured out how to make it do. Outside, snow was coming down in the determined way it had been coming down for 3 days, steady and unremarkable, as if the sky had simply decided this was how things were going to be for a while. What does he want? She asked. I think, Mrs. Olson said carefully, that he wanted to break you on that platform and you didn't break. And now he's angry about it in the way that cruel people get angry when their cruelty doesn't have the effect they intended. So he'll keep at it. He'll keep at it, Mrs. Olson confirmed. Evelyn absorbed this. Then I'll keep at what I'm doing, she said, which is working and being here and not breaking. Mrs. Olson looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in her face that was not quite pity, closer to that sound she'd made on the platform, the sound that was respect, the sound of someone recognizing something worth recognizing. Yes, Mrs. Olson said, that's exactly right. Gideon came in from the barn an hour later, stamping snow from his boots, and he saw the pie, and he saw Evelyn's face, which she had composed carefully, but apparently not carefully enough. What happened? He said. She told him. All of it, plainly, without softening anything, because she had decided in the past hour that the only way to manage what Clayton Marsh was doing was to be completely transparent about it with the person it most directly affected. Gideon listened. He took off his coat and hung it, and he sat down at the table, and he put his hands flat on the surface in a way that reminded her of what she'd done with her own hands earlier, that deliberate stilling of something that wanted to move fast. He doesn't stop, he said. Apparently not. He looked at the tabletop, then at her. What he's saying, does it bother you that he's saying it about me, about you staying here? She looked at him directly. It bothers me that you might be affected by it, that your name might be... I'm not asking about my name, he said. I know what my name means in this town, and I know who's going to listen to Clayton Marsh and who isn't. I'm asking if it bothers you. She thought about that honestly. The part that bothers me, she said slowly, is the part where he's right that I came west desperate. He's not wrong about that. I was desperate and I didn't see clearly, and those are my facts to carry. She paused. What he's wrong about is what I am now, and what this place is. The sentence landed in the space between them, and she felt, too late, that it had said more than she'd strictly intended. He held her gaze for a moment that was just a beat too long to be impersonal. Then he looked away. We'll handle it, he said. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise in the romantic sense. It was just the kind of thing a man said when he'd decided something privately and was making it briefly visible. She looked out at the snow. She thought, I don't know what I'm doing. And then, but I am still here. And somehow, as it had been on that first night, that felt like exactly enough. The rumors didn't stop. She'd known they wouldn't. Mrs. Olson had been clear about that, and Evelyn had been clear with herself about it that evening by the wood stove. But knowing a thing was coming and experiencing the actual shape of it were different. The rumors spread through Millhaven the way winter spread through Wyoming, quietly at first, then all at once, until you looked up one day and realized the landscape had entirely changed, and you couldn't remember exactly when it happened. She heard them in pieces. A comment from the dry goods clerk that was almost a question, but not quite. A look exchanged between two women at the other end of the mercantile that stopped when she turned. Ruth Calloway told her, plainly and without softening it, that Clayton had been making rounds at the saloon telling anyone who'd listen that Gideon Blackwood had taken in a desperate woman who'd come west shopping for a husband and had ended up living off a widower's charity because no one else would have her. He's enjoying it, Ruth said. They were sitting in the Calloway kitchen, which was the third time Evelyn had been invited there, and the first time she'd felt comfortable enough to sit without watching the door. That's the thing about Clayton. He doesn't just want to hurt people. He wants to watch them react to being hurt. When you didn't react the right way on the platform, it made everything worse. I know, Evelyn said. Do you know what he said about Gideon specifically? Ruth wrapped both hands around her own teacup. That Gideon was always too soft to run that ranch properly. That taking you in proved it, that a real rancher wouldn't let sentiment get in the way of his reputation. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. And what do people say back to that? Ruth hesitated. Tell me, Evelyn said. Some of them agree with him. Ruth said it carefully, but said it. Not about you exactly, but about Gideon. There are men in this town who've always thought he was too reserved, too slow to assert himself. They see the ranch, and they think it should be bigger than it is, more aggressive. And they've always thought of Gideon as a man who was content when he should have been hungry. And now they think I'm proof of that. Some of them, Ruth looked up. But not all. The Hargrove brothers have said publicly that Gideon Blackwood is one of the few men in this valley whose word means something. And Mr. Hofstetter, she paused. Even Hofstetter said that what Clayton did at the station was beneath a man. Evelyn absorbed that. The arithmetic of it. Some against, some for, the majority probably watching from a comfortable distance, unwilling to commit either way, until the situation resolved itself into something that required a clear opinion. The problem, Evelyn said slowly, is that Clayton doesn't need a majority. He just needs to make enough noise that Gideon's name gets complicated. Ruth nodded. She understood frontier economies of reputation. Out here, a man's name was a kind of currency, and currency could be devalued with enough sustained effort even if the devaluing was dishonest. When Evelyn got back to the ranch that afternoon, she found Gideon in the barn working on the tack, with the focused silence that she'd come to understand meant he was thinking rather than simply working. She stood in the barn doorway and watched him for a moment. "You've heard something," she said. He didn't look up from the leather strap he was conditioning. "Calloway said something to me this morning when I was in town for the feed." "What did he say?" Gideon set the strap down. He didn't answer immediately. There was the kind of pause he had when the answer required care. "He asked me if I'd thought through what I was doing," he said, "having you here. He wasn't unkind about it. He's a decent man. But he asked the question, which means other people are asking it, and he was the one who decided to ask it to my face." Evelyn came into the barn and sat on a hay bale because her feet were cold from the walk and because she needed to think, and she thought better sitting down. "Do you regret it?" she asked. He looked at her then. "No." "But it's affecting your standing." "My standing is my own business," he said, and there was something firm at the base of the words. Not anger, just decision. "I did what was right on that platform, and I'd do it again. I'm not going to apologize for that because Clayton Marsh has been telling stories in saloons." "I know you wouldn't," she said. "That's not what I'm asking." "What are you asking?" She looked at her hands. "I'm asking whether we need to change the arrangement in some way, make it look different than it looks, so that there's less for him to use." There was a silence. "Look different how?" he said carefully. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe I take a room in town, at the boarding house. Come out here to work during the days and—" She heard how this sounded as she said it and stopped. It sounded like retreat. It sounded like Clayton Marsh had succeeded in changing the shape of her life. "No," Gideon said. "Gideon, no." He picked up the strap again, not because the work needed doing right now, but because he needed something to do with his hands. That's exactly what he wants. He wants you uncertain. He wants you moving around because of him. He wants this. He gestured at the space between them, at the barn, at the ranch beyond it, to feel fragile because he's pushing on it. He set the strap down again. He was not a man who wasted words, but now the words were coming with more weight than usual. "This isn't fragile. You've been here 4 months, and you've worked harder than anyone I've seen on this ranch. And the garden is going to be extraordinary come spring, and I eat better than I have in 3 years, and I—" He stopped, recalibrated. "I'm not going to let him take that." The barn was quiet. Outside, a horse shifted in its stall. The wind moved. "All right," she said softly. "All right," he said. But Clayton Marsh had no intention of letting things resolve quietly. Whatever he'd wanted from that day on the platform, and she'd stopped trying to fully understand the wants of a man who would orchestrate that kind of cruelty, he had apparently decided that her continued presence on Gideon's ranch was a personal affront. He wasn't finished. He was simply letting the winter pass before he decided what to do about it. The sign came in late February. She found it on the fence post at the edge of the ranch road. A piece of board with words burned into it in rough letters, the kind of message a man left when he wanted to communicate something he didn't have the courage to say face to face. She stood and looked at it for a long moment in the cold morning air, and then she pulled it off the post and carried it to the barn and put it face down behind a stack of feed sacks so that Gideon wouldn't see it first. He found it anyway. Somehow he always knew when something was wrong on his land. He came into the barn that afternoon and looked at her carefully. The specific look that had developed over months, the one that said he'd noticed something was off, and she showed it to him rather than pretend it wasn't there. He stood and read it. His jaw tightened in the way it did when he was managing something. "He's escalating," she said. Yes. He set the board down, face down, the same way she had. He's bored and he's angry, and he's the kind of man who can't leave a thing alone once he's decided it belongs to him in some way. I never belonged to him. I know that. He looked at her steadily. He doesn't. In his head, you're still something he lost, something he had, and then you didn't respond correctly, and now you're something he lost. He shook his head slightly. Men like that don't let go of what they believe they've lost. She thought about the letters in her trunk, the soft folded paper, the careful words someone else had written, the fiction of a man with apple trees and a respect for quiet women. She thought about how long she'd held those letters, how much of herself she'd given to a story that had never been real. "What do we do?" she asked. "I'm going to talk to Sheriff Beaumont," he said. "Today. He'll say it's just words." "Probably." Gideon looked at the board. "But I want Beaumont to know it started, because this isn't where it ends." He was right about that in a way neither of them could have fully anticipated. March came in with a thaw, and then a cold snap that killed the thaw, and then another thaw that finally held. The ranch became mud season, which was its own particular kind of hard. Every task took longer, every surface was treacherous, and the cattle needed more attention as they moved with the changing ground. She'd become genuinely useful with the cattle over the winter, more than she'd expected. Gideon had shown her the basics out of practical necessity when he was working alone on a day she'd asked to help, and she'd turned out to have a steadiness around the animals that surprised him and pleased her. "You're good with them," he'd said one evening, the kind of observation he made rarely and therefore meant precisely. "They don't judge you," she said, and then caught the thing underneath that statement and looked away before he could. In town, Clayton Marsh had found a new strategy. He'd begun insinuating, to anyone who would engage with it, that Gideon's ranch was struggling, that taking in a woman with no means had stretched his already thin resources, that by spring there would be real financial difficulties out at Blackwood's. None of this was true in any way she could verify from the ledgers she'd come to know well through Gideon's evening accounting sessions, which had gradually become something she participated in rather than observed. She was better at numbers than he'd expected, and he'd said so, plainly, and she'd started catching things in the columns that had been slightly off, small errors of category that added up. But truth wasn't required for a rumor to damage. A rumor about financial instability could affect Gideon's credit with the feed supplier, could affect whether the bank looked at him differently, could affect the small economies of trust that a working ranch depended on in a territory where cash was thin and reputation was the real currency. She brought this to him directly one evening in March, the ledger open between them. "He's going to move to your finances next," she said. "Probably already has started. You should speak to the feed supplier before it gets there." He looked at the ledger, then at her. "How do you know that?" "Because it's what I'd do if I wanted to damage someone and I couldn't damage them directly." She kept her voice level. "He can't break you. He's already tried the direct route. So he's going to go for the things that hold you up." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Not dismissive, he was thinking. "You've thought about this a lot," he said. "I've had practice thinking about how damage works," she said. "When you've been on the receiving end of it often enough." He looked at her, and the look had something in it she couldn't quite name. Not pity, she'd have bristled at pity. Something closer to recognition. The look of one person seeing the shape of another person's history and understanding what it had cost. "I'll go see Ellis at the feed store tomorrow," he said. "Good." He went the next morning and came back with the expression of a man who had arrived just ahead of something. "Clayton had been in," he said, 2 days ago. "Ellis didn't say what specifically, but he told me—" Gideon set his hat on the peg and stood in the doorway with the look of someone deciding how to frame what he was about to say. "He told me that Blackwood's credit was still good with him, and that a man who'd earned good credit didn't lose it on someone else's word." Evelyn felt something in her chest unclench by a degree. "Ellis is a good man," she said. "He is." Gideon came fully into the room, but not everyone will be, and Clayton knows that. The thing they'd both seen coming arrived on a Thursday in April. She heard them before she saw them, heard the horses on the road while she was in the garden, which was waking up now in the mud, and the tentative spring light, showing the first green edges of what the winter garlic was becoming. She'd been on her knees in the soft earth with her hands in it, which was where she felt most like herself these days. and she registered the sound, and something in her went still in the particular way it did when her body knew something before her mind did. She stood up. There were 5 of them on the road. Clayton in front, his horse high-stepping in the mud like the animal was as aggressive as its rider wanted to be. Behind him, 4 men she half recognized from the town. Not friends, hired friends. The kind of men who showed up for situations like this because they'd been given reason to and paid something for the inconvenience. She didn't move from the garden. Clayton pulled his horse up at the fence and looked at her with the expression she remembered from the platform. That particular combination of performance and genuine contempt that she had come to understand was not a mask, but was actually how he related to people he believed were beneath him. "Miss Harper," he said, like a man savoring a word. "Mr. Marsh," she made her voice as flat as she could make it. "I came to give you a final opportunity." He said final with enormous satisfaction. "To settle this like sensible people." "Settle what?" she said. "There's nothing between us to settle." "You came out here to marry me," he said. And there it was. The revision of history that she'd heard was coming, the version of events that he'd apparently started believing or decided to perform so fully that believing it was beside the point. "You came out here on my name, under my invitation. I came out here under a lie," she said, "that you told, for a bet. You came under my name," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "And now you're living under Blackwood's roof and causing problems for both of us. I'm giving you a chance to come back to town with me." He paused, and she registered the word back with genuine revulsion. "And stop this." "Stop what?" she said again. I'm standing in a garden. You're embarrassing me." And there it was. The actual thing, the root of all of it, plain and ugly and finally visible. Not her safety, not some claim, not even Clayton's cruelty for its own sake. It was that she existed, continued to exist, in a place he could see, in a life that looked better than the story he'd told about her. "You should have gone back to Kansas." "I have nothing to go back to," she said. "That's your problem." "No," she said. "It stopped being a problem a while ago." Something moved in his face, an ugly shift, the recalibration she'd seen on the platform, but this time without the amusement. The amusement was gone. What was underneath it was worse. "Get her," he said. 2 of the men behind him moved. She did not run into the house. Later, when she thought about this, she could not fully explain the decision, except that running felt like an ending to something she was not willing to end. She went to the porch. Not run. She went to the porch. Not running. Walking. With purpose, which was different, which left her in control of where she was going and how fast. She went through the front door and she did not stop in the main room. She went directly to the corner where she'd seen it weeks ago and never touched. Her father's shotgun, which she'd told Gideon about in that halting conversation one evening when they'd talked about where she'd come from and what she'd brought, and which he'd looked at and said, "Put it where it makes sense," and she'd put it there because that corner was where her father would have put it. She broke it, checked the chambers, loaded, she'd made sure of that weeks ago without knowing exactly why, some instinct, and snapped it back. She went to the porch. The 2 men had stopped at the garden fence, not because they were uncertain, because Gideon had appeared at the barn door. He'd heard the horses, she understood later, and he'd come from the barn without a weapon because he'd sized up the situation on the road as a confrontation he could manage with presence, and because he was a man who didn't reach for a weapon unless he absolutely had to. The 5 of them saw him come out of the barn. The calculation in their posture shifted. Clayton kept his eyes on her. "Blackwood," he said, without looking at Gideon. "This doesn't concern you." "This is my property," Gideon said, with the same unhurried certainty she'd heard on the platform in September. "Everything on it concerns me." "She's not yours." "No," Gideon said. "She's her own. But she's on my land and you're not welcome on it, and I'd like you to leave." Clayton smiled. The cold, performative smile of a man who had brought 4 men specifically to counteract exactly this response. And then Evelyn stepped to the edge of the porch. She didn't raise the shotgun yet. She held it, barrel angled toward the ground, the way her father had taught her. Not aggressive, just present. But every man on that road saw it, and every man on that road understood what they were looking at. A woman who knew how to use what she was holding. "Clayton Marsh," she said. Her voice was even. She discovered with some surprise, not afraid. She was something past afraid, something on the other side of it that felt almost like calm. I'm going to say this once. I did not come to Wyoming to belong to you. I did not come to belong to anyone. I came because I was foolish enough to believe in letters that weren't real, and I made a mistake, and I've paid for that mistake in ways that are entirely sufficient. What I am not going to do is leave. She paused. I am not going to leave this ranch, and I am not going to leave this valley, and I am not going to stop existing in a way that is inconvenient for you. So whatever you think you're going to accomplish today, I suggest you reconsider it. Silence. The horses shifted, mud under their hooves. One of the hired men looked at Clayton. The look said they had not been told there would be a woman with a shotgun. You can't, Clayton started. She's done talking. The voice came from the road beyond the ranch fence. Multiple voices, actually. She registered it in pieces, not quite understanding at first. And then she looked, and she saw them. 4 men on horseback at the road's edge, having come down from the north, which was the direction of the Hargrove Ranch. The Hargrove brothers, she understood, who had said publicly that Gideon Blackwood's word meant something. And behind them, Sheriff Beaumont on his gray horse, with the expression of a man who had been suspicious that he'd be needed here today and was not pleased to have been right. Clayton turned in his saddle. The sight of the sheriff altered the architecture of the situation entirely. Beaumont, he said, and managed to make it sound like he'd expected this, like it was not a problem. Clayton. Beaumont rode up to the fence and looked at the scene with the slow, cataloging attention of a man whose job was reading situations. His eyes moved from the hired men to Gideon to Evelyn on the porch. What's happening here? Just a conversation, Clayton said. Looked like more than that from the road. Beaumont's eyes settled on Evelyn, on the shotgun. Miss Harper, you all right? Fine, Sheriff, she said. Mr. Marsh and his friends were just leaving. The weight of the moment was specific and clear. 5 men who had ridden out here with the intention of removing a woman from a ranch by force were now looking at a sheriff. 4 witnesses from a neighboring property, a rancher, and a woman on a porch with her father's shotgun, and the arithmetic of it had changed in a way that was not reversible. One of the hired men turned his horse without waiting for Clayton's word. Then another. The third looked at Clayton with the expression of a man who had accepted payment for a job that was no longer the job he'd thought it was. Clayton's jaw was tight. His eyes were on Evelyn with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the performative contempt of the platform, not the calculated entertainment of a man who believed he was in control. This was something rawer and uglier. The expression of a man confronting the fact that the thing he'd reached for was not where he'd believed it to be, and had not been for some time. This isn't finished, he said. He said it to the air, not to anyone specifically, which was itself a kind of defeat. It is for today, Beaumont said, and I'd advise you strongly, Clayton, to let it be finished for considerably longer than that. He held the other man's eyes with the steadiness that came from 20 years of holding difficult situations on the frontier. We're clear? Clear? Clayton turned his horse. He rode back down the road without looking at anyone again. The 2 remaining hired men followed him, and then the Hargrove brothers were through the fence and dismounting, and Beaumont was at the porch. And Evelyn lowered the shotgun and found that her hands, which had been absolutely steady while she needed them to be, were now shaking in the particular way of a body dealing with aftermath. She gripped the gun with both hands and looked at the mountains. Miss Harper. Beaumont stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her. You want to tell me what's been going on out here? The full account. Yes, she said. Come inside. Gideon was beside her then. She hadn't heard him cross the yard, and he put his hand on her elbow briefly, the lightest possible contact, steadying rather than claiming, and then removed it, and that small gesture was so exactly right that it briefly threatened the composure she'd been maintaining. I'm all right, she said, to him, and only him. I know, he said, but he stayed close as they went inside. She told Beaumont everything, the sign on the fence post, the rumors in town, the escalating pattern of it, the way it had moved from words to property to this. Gideon added what he'd seen and heard. The Hargrove brothers, James and Carl, who were sitting at the table with coffee that Evelyn had put in front of them without quite realizing she was doing it, confirmed what they'd witnessed approaching the property. Beaumont listened without interrupting. I was a man who had learned that interrupting people who were giving accounts produced worse accounts. When it was done, he sat for a moment with his own coffee and looked at the table. "He hasn't broken any law yet that I can prove in front of a judge," he said, and she heard the "and yet" in his voice without him saying it. The sign was harassment. What happened today was, depending on how a judge reads it, either trespassing or intimidation, possibly both. He looked up. "I can have a conversation with Clayton that makes clear he's being watched. But Evelyn," it was the first time he'd used her name, and it had a different quality than Marsh. "He's not going to stop because I had a conversation with him." "I know," she said. "He's going to stop," Beaumont said carefully, "when it costs him something he's not willing to pay." She looked at the sheriff and understood what he was telling her without telling her, that the law had edges, that a man with money and family name in a small territory could do considerable damage inside those edges before he crossed them, that what she had was witnesses, a history, and the beginning of a paper record. She looked at Gideon. He looked back at her, and she could see him thinking what she was thinking. "What do we need to document?" she said to Beaumont. The sheriff almost smiled. "Everything, starting from the first day." After Beaumont and the Hargrove brothers left, James Hargrove had stopped at the door to tell Evelyn quietly that what she'd done on that porch was the most sensible thing he'd seen in years, and she'd thanked him in a voice that was steadier than she felt. After they all left and the horses went down the road and the ranch was quiet again, she sat at the table and did not move for a long time. Gideon sat across from her. "That was extraordinary," he said. He did not mean the compliment the way a man used it to flatter a woman. He meant it the way you described something that had genuinely surprised you. "I was terrified," she said. "I know. My hands are still shaking. I can see that." He reached across the table, not to take her hand, but to set something next to it. Her cup of tea, which had gone cold while she talked to Beaumont, which he'd apparently heated up somewhere between Beaumont leaving and now. "Drink that." She wrapped both hands around the cup, looked at him. "How did the Hargrove brothers know to come?" she asked. Something moved in his face. "I'd talked to them last week, told them what had been happening, and that I thought it was going to come to something." She stared at him. "You knew." "I suspected." He held her gaze steadily. "I didn't want to frighten you with what might not happen." "And Beaumont?" "I went to see him again 2 days ago. Told him I thought Clayton was going to move." She absorbed this. He had been preparing quietly, without telling her, without making it alarming, arranging the pieces so that when the thing happened, she would not be alone in it. "You could have told me," she said, "but there was no accusation in it." "You would have spent the week terrified instead of just today," he said simply. She couldn't argue with that. It was the truth. And it was also, she understood in the way she understood things about him, slowly and with certainty. An act of care. Not the dramatic kind, the specific kind that paid attention to what the other person actually needed. "Gideon," she said, and then stopped because she did not know how to finish the sentence. He waited. "I don't know how to—" She stopped again, put the cup down, pressed her still unsteady hands flat on the table. "I was told once, by a man who turned out to know nothing, that he understood what quiet men needed." She watched his face. "I think I'm starting to understand what one actually looks like." The fire in the wood stove worked steadily. Outside, the April light was going long and golden over the mud and the green edges of the spring grass and the mountains that she had long stopped finding theoretical. Gideon looked at her with the expression she'd seen for the first time on the night he'd talked about January and his wife's supply order, the expression of a man who had something he was choosing carefully how to hold. "Evelyn," he said, in the particular way he used her name when it meant more than just addressing her. "I know," she said. And she did. She did not know the full shape of it, not yet, and she did not think either of them was ready to name it completely. But she knew it was there, had been there for some time, had been growing in the same quiet way the garden grew, not through any single dramatic event, but through the daily accumulation of mornings and evenings, and small decisions and honest arguments and hands that healed fence posts and cups of coffee put on the table at exactly the right moment. She picked up her tea. He picked up his coffee. The ranch settled around them, mud and spring and everything still unfinished, and they sat with it, and that was enough for now, and they both knew it, and neither of them needed to say so. Beaumont came back 2 days later with paper. Not a warrant. It hadn't risen to that yet, and all three of them understood the territory's limits on what a sheriff could do with what they had. But he brought a formal record of complaint, which he set on the table and asked Evelyn to sign, and which he would then file at the territorial office in Cheyenne as an official account of the harassment, the sign, and what had happened in April on the ranch road. "This is the beginning of something," Beaumont told her, with the frankness of a man who respected people enough not to dress bad news in good clothes. "Not the end. Clayton's going to know I filed it, and he's going to be angry, but it means the next thing he does happens on record, and the one after that." Evelyn signed the paper with a steady hand. "What about the men he brought?" Gideon asked. "Two of them are drifters. Gone already, most likely." Beaumont folded the document carefully. "The other two are local, Frank Eddins and that younger Crawley boy. I've had conversations with both of them that I believe were persuasive." "Persuasive how?" Evelyn asked. "I explained the difference between being paid by Clayton Marsh to ride onto a man's property and being charged as an accessory to whatever Clayton Marsh eventually does on that property." The sheriff picked up his hat. "They found the distinction clarifying. After he left, she stood at the window and watched his horse go down the road until it disappeared around the bend, and she thought about the word beginning, the way Beaumont had used it. She had been in Wyoming 8 months. She had arrived as the end of something, the end of a life in Kansas, the end of a story she'd told herself about what her future would look like, the end of a particular kind of hope that she understood now had been built on sand. She had not expected, in the wreckage of all those endings, to find herself at the beginning of something else. Not this beginning, not here. "You're thinking hard," Gideon said from behind her. "I'm always thinking hard," she said. "You're just usually too polite to say so." "I'm not polite," he said. "I'm quiet. There's a difference." She almost turned around, didn't quite. "What's the difference?" "Polite means you're performing something. Quiet means you're just not saying the thing yet." She did turn around then. He was at the table with his coffee, watching her with the directness that she'd gotten used to over months, and still somehow caught her off guard at specific moments. "What thing aren't you saying?" she asked. He looked at his coffee, looked back at her. "Several things," he said. "I'm working on the order." She looked at him for a moment. This man who had been wrong about January every year, who had not told her about his preparations before the confrontation, because he understood that a week of anticipatory fear was worse than one day of actual fear, who had put a cup of tea on the table at the exact right moment, who had said this isn't fragile with a conviction she'd filed away and returned to in quiet moments, the way you return to something that has become load-bearing without your quite deciding to let it be. "Take your time," she said, and went back to the garden. The garden in late April was its own argument about persistence. The garlic had come in strong, better than she'd hoped, given the winter, and she'd put in onions and early greens, and the beds that had been a tangle of defeat last September were now ordered and productive and showing the first real evidence that the work had been worth doing. She spent long hours in it, which Gideon had stopped commenting on because he understood by now that the garden was not merely practical. It was where she thought. It was where she managed whatever needed managing before she could bring it back inside and be around another person with some equanimity. She thought, in the garden, about what it meant to choose something freely. She had not chosen freely in Kansas. She had chosen from a narrowing set of options, from a position of quiet desperation. She'd done her best to be honest with herself about, but had perhaps not been fully honest enough. She had chosen those letters because they were there, and because she had wanted something, and because she'd convinced herself that want was close enough to wisdom to be a reliable guide. She understood now that want and wisdom were different instruments and had to be used differently. Want told you what you moved toward. Wisdom told you whether what you were moving toward was real. What was real was the ranch, the work, the early mornings with coffee and whoever they happened to become during those hours, the arguments about supply orders and wood stove technique and the correct way to stake young tomato plants, which she had strong opinions about, and so did he. And they were not the same opinions, and that had stopped being aggravating somewhere around the third time it happened, and had become something she looked forward to without quite admitting it. What was real was Gideon Blackwood, who was as far from the fiction of those letters as anything she could have imagined, not in a disappointing way, in the way of something that was actual rather than invented, with edges and inconveniences and a stubbornness that drove her to distraction on specific occasions, and who was more himself on any given Tuesday morning than Clayton's letter writer had been across 31 composed and carefully constructed pages. She was in love with him. She'd known it for a while in the way you know something you're not ready to act on, present in your peripheral vision, taking up space without announcing itself, waiting for you to be ready to look at it directly. She was looking at it now, in the mud of the garden, in the April light, and it was terrifying, and also, underneath the terror, something warmer than she'd felt in a very long time. The question was not whether it was real. The question was whether she was someone who could trust her own judgment about real things, given recent evidence. She sat back on her heels and looked at the garlic. The garlic, at least, she was certain about. She went inside and made supper, and they ate it, and afterward Gideon did the accounts, and she read. She'd gotten through the almanac and had found 2 novels in the box Mrs. Olson had brought over one afternoon, declaring that a house with only an almanac for reading material was a crime against civilization. She was reading one of them now without retaining much of it, because her mind kept leaving the page and going somewhere else. "You're reading the same paragraph," Gideon said, without looking up from his ledger. "I'm not." "You've been on it for 10 minutes," she looked up. "You've been watching me read." "I've been watching the fire," he said, which was not entirely false. The wood stove was directly behind her. "And you happened to be in front of it." She closed the book on her finger. "Gideon." He set down his pen. The way he did it, deliberately, with the care of a man who understood the weight of what was coming, told her that he had also been somewhere else tonight behind the ledger. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the difference between choosing something and landing in something." He waited. "When I came to Wyoming," she said, "I landed in a situation. I didn't choose it. I ended up here." She gestured at the room, at the house, at everything it contained, because there was nowhere else to go and you offered, and I had $4 and no options. That's not a choice. That's a landing. "I know," he said quietly. "I need you to understand that what I'm saying now is different," she said. "It's not a landing. It's a choice. Those are different things, and I need them to be different, because the last time I confused them, I ended up on a train platform being laughed at, and I won't—" Her voice snagged, just slightly, on the edge of something, and she steadied it. "I won't do that to myself again, and I won't do it to you." He was very still. "What are you choosing?" he said, in the careful voice he used when the thing he was saying mattered more than he typically let things matter out loud. "I'm choosing to stay," she said. "Not because I have nowhere to go. Because this is where I want to be." She held his gaze. "Because you are someone I want to be near, and I have enough sense now to know the difference between that and desperation. And this is not desperation. This is the most clear-eyed thing I've said in a year." The fire moved. Outside, the spring wind ran across the valley. Gideon looked at her for a long moment with the expression that had no easy name. Not surprised, because she didn't think she'd fully surprised him, but something like the feeling of a thing becoming real that had previously only been possible. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right." "That morning at the station." He looked at the table briefly, then back at her. "When I stepped forward, I told you it was because what he was doing was wrong. And that was true. But it was also, you were standing there, and you said, 'Are you finished?' in that voice, and something—" He stopped, worked for the right word, and she understood that for a man who was precise with language in exact proportion to how much something cost him, this imprecision was itself information. Something happened, right then. I didn't step forward only because it was the right thing. I stepped forward because I couldn't not. She looked at him. "I've been aware of that since September," he said. "I haven't said it because you had enough to manage and because I wasn't—" Another pause. "I didn't want to be another man making claims on you before you'd had the chance to figure out who you were going to be here." The sentence landed in her chest in a place that was not entirely comfortable and was entirely necessary. "That's why you waited," she said. "Yes." That was— She didn't have the word either, it turned out. Some things were like that. That was the right thing to do. "I thought so," he said. "Didn't always feel like it." She almost smiled at that. The honesty of it. The admission that patience was not the same as not feeling things. "So?" she said. "So," he agreed. They sat with it, this thing that was now in the open, named and real, and taking up its actual space in the room. And it was not as dramatic as she'd have predicted it might be. back in the days when she'd imagined important moments would feel large and conclusive. It felt quieter than that, more solid, less like a door opening and more like the recognition that you had already been inside for some time without noticing when you'd walked in. "I'm not an easy person," she said, because she needed to say it, needed him to have the full picture. "I'm stubborn, and I have opinions about everything, and I reorganize things without asking, and I will argue with you about supply orders until one of us gives up, and it won't be me." "I know," he said, "and she faltered. "I'm not fully healed from what happened, from all of it, the farm, the letters, the platform. I thought I was more healed than I am, and then something happens and it's still there. I don't think that goes away quickly." "I know that too," he said. "I spent 3 years learning that loss doesn't follow a schedule." She nodded. He had told her over those winter months more about his wife. Her name had been Clara. She'd been from Ohio. She'd taught herself to play the fiddle because she thought the mountains deserved music. She'd died in 2 weeks of a fever that the doctor couldn't stop. He'd spoken of her with a grief that had become, over years, not smaller, but different, familiar, incorporated, part of the structure of who he was. He was not over it. He wasn't going to say he was. She had respected that, and respected it still. "I'm not trying to replace anything," she said. "I know. I'm not looking for a replacement." He held her gaze steadily. "I'm looking at you." That was when Clayton Marsh rode into their lives for the last time, though they didn't know it was the last time yet. The awareness of him had receded somewhat after the April confrontation. Beaumont's formal record had put a certain chill on Clayton's more visible maneuvers, and the town had shifted in a way that was gradual but real, the way tides shift. People who had been neutral had started making small, clear choices. Ellis at the feed store had extended Gideon's credit in a way that was publicly mentioned. The Hargrove brothers had been vocal at the saloon, which was where vocal counted, about what they'd witnessed in April and what they thought of it. Ruth Calloway's family, who had standing in the community, had invited both Evelyn and Gideon to supper at the Calloway house, in a gesture that was not casual and was understood not to be casual. Clayton had not been visible, which was, as Beaumont had noted when he'd stopped by one afternoon in May, not the same as Clayton being inactive. It meant he was adjusting his approach. What he'd adjusted to, they learned in June, was lawyers. The Marsh family owned land, a significant amount of it, the original homestead plus purchases made over 2 decades. And what Clayton had done, quietly and through a territorial attorney, was file a claim that the eastern boundary of Gideon's property had been incorrectly surveyed 8 years ago, and that 300 acres of Blackwood land were in fact marshland based on the original territorial grant documents. It was, as Gideon said, with the flatness of a man looking at something that requires all his control to assess without reacting, a lie. "But it's a filed lie," he said. They were sitting at the table with the document that had arrived from the territorial court, delivered by a writer that morning. "That's different from the other kinds." "Can he make it stick?" she asked. "If the survey record is ambiguous, and it might be, surveys out here 8 years ago weren't always precise, he can make it expensive." He set the document down. "Defending a land claim costs money I don't have a lot of." She looked at the document, read it carefully, which took time because legal language was its own dialect. "He's claiming the eastern section. That's where your best winter pasture is." "Yes." "He couldn't take you down by reputation," she said slowly. "He couldn't take you down by intimidation. So now he's going after the thing the ranch actually runs on." Gideon looked at her. "Yes." "He planned this," she said. "The rest of it, the confrontation in April, the harassment, that have been anger. But this was planned. He was building toward this." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "I think so." She sat back, thought about it the way she'd taught herself to think about Clayton's strategies, from the inside out, from what he actually wanted, which was not the land, she was nearly certain. The land was a weapon. What Clayton wanted was what he'd always wanted, to break Gideon Blackwood, to prove that Gideon had been wrong to step forward on that platform, to make Gideon pay the cost of having interfered. She was the original cause, but she'd become incidental. This was between Clayton and Gideon now, and Clayton was using the law the same way he'd used the letters, as a tool designed by other people that he was repurposing for his own ends. "What's the original survey document?" she asked. "At the county records office in Cheyenne. Is it ambiguous?" "I don't know," he admitted. I've never looked at it. I know where my fence lines are, and I've never had cause to question them. We need to look at it, she said. I know. And we need someone who understands land law. She looked at him. Not Beaumont, a lawyer. Lawyers cost. I know what lawyers cost, she said. Who is the most knowledgeable person in this territory about land grants and survey disputes? He thought about it. Man named Aldridge in Cheyenne. He handled the Ritter case 2 years ago, which was a similar kind of claim. He won. Write to him today, she said. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to associate with a man recalibrating his expectations of what was possible. Evelyn, write to him today, she said again. I have $50. She saw his expression shift. I saved it. From the money Mrs. Calloway paid me for the sewing work, and what I've earned helping Mrs. Olson with her kitchen garden. $50 isn't a retainer, but it's a beginning, and if Aldridge is worth anything, he'll take the case on a deferred basis if the claim is strong. That's your money, he said. I know whose money it is, she said evenly, and I know what I want to do with it. The argument that followed was not brief and was not entirely comfortable, because they were both stubborn people who had strong and not entirely compatible feelings about the relationship between money and obligation and what it meant to offer one's resources in a situation like this. Gideon did not want to take money from her because he believed a man managed his own land troubles. She did not want to have money that she was not using in a useful way when there was a useful way in front of her. They went around the question 3 times from different angles before she finally said, with some heat, Gideon, Clayton Marsh is going after this ranch because of me, because you stepped forward on that platform. If you can't accept my help with that, then your pride is going to cost us 300 acres, and I'm telling you right now that I will never forgive you for being too proud to keep what you've earned. The word us hung in the air between them. She'd said it without thinking, and she wasn't going to take it back. He was very still. All right, he said finally. All right, she said. He wrote to Aldridge that evening. She helped him with the letter. She was better at formal written language than he was, which they'd discovered when he'd asked her to look over a letter to the feed supplier, and she'd quietly restructured the entire thing. And the letter that went to Cheyenne was clear and specific and made the strongest possible case in the fewest possible words. Aldridge wrote back in 10 days. He would take the case. He had questions about the original survey. He would need Gideon in Cheyenne for 2 days to review the documents, and he would need $120 total if the case went to arbitration, $70 if it resolved beforehand. They went to Cheyenne in July. This was the first time they had traveled together anywhere, and the journey, 2 days by train, Gideon having arranged for a neighbor to manage the cattle, had a particular quality that was different from everything that had come before. They were not employer and employee, not quite, had not been for some time. They were not yet whatever they were becoming, not officially, not in any way that had been stated formally. They were somewhere in between, in the space that had been created by the conversation by the wood stove and the word us, and the things that had been said without being finished, and the space was not uncomfortable, but it was present. She was aware of him on the train in a way she managed carefully, aware of the particular way he watched the landscape moving past the window. Not sentimental, just attentive, the way he was attentive to everything. Aware of the way he handed her things, her tea from the dining car, the lantern when they transferred stations at dusk, with the unhurried care of a man who didn't make a performance of looking after someone. In Cheyenne, they stayed at different boarding houses, which was correct and which neither of them made a significant thing of. They met Aldridge the first morning in his office, which was small and organized and smelled of old documents and pipe tobacco. And the lawyer was a dry, precise man in his 50s who spent 40 minutes asking questions that were sharper than they sounded, and taking notes in handwriting so small she could barely read it upside down. Then Aldridge went to the records office and pulled the original survey document, and they spent 3 hours going over it on his office table. The survey was, as Gideon had feared, imprecise by modern standards. The benchmarks used in the original territorial grant were natural features, a particular rock formation, a creek bend, a stand of cottonwoods, that had shifted or been removed or had never been accurately fixed to begin with. Clayton's lawyer had identified 2 of these ambiguities and was using them to argue that the eastern line sat consistently inside where Blackwood's fence was. But Aldridge had found something else. He found it in the secondary documents, the ones filed alongside the survey. a correspondence between the original territorial land office and the surveyor in which the surveyor had explicitly described the eastern line using measurements that, when applied to current landmarks, placed the boundary exactly where Gideon's fence had always been. This letter, Aldridge said, pointing to it with one precise finger, is the survey document. The map is the illustration of the survey document. The map is ambiguous. The letter is not. Is that enough? Evelyn asked. Aldridge looked at her over his spectacles in the manner of a man who had been surprised by questions from that direction. It's enough to argue effectively, he said. In arbitration, yes, I believe so. She looked at Gideon. He was looking at the letter with the expression of a man seeing something he'd been afraid might not exist. Then we argue it, he said. The arbitration was scheduled for September. They returned to Millhaven in late July with a case that was not certain, but was real. And with something else that was also not certain, but was also real. Some change in the texture of what they were to each other, clarified by the particular intimacy of sitting across a lawyer's table together looking at a document that represented Gideon's life's work and fighting for it as a unified thing. On the train home, she'd fallen asleep against the window in the early evening and woken to find the car dark and Gideon sitting across from her, awake, which she registered in the first slow seconds of waking before she was fully coherent. He was looking out the window at the dark landscape going past. How long was I asleep? She asked. 3 hours, he said. You should have woken me. You needed sleep. She looked at him in the dim car. You watched the dark for 3 hours so I could sleep. I wasn't watching you, he said, in the careful voice that meant he had been. I was watching the landscape. In the dark. There's a moon. She looked at the window. There was, in fact, a partial moon. It made the land outside look silver and enormous, the kind of landscape that rendered you briefly aware of your own smallness. Gideon, she said. When we get back, she said, I'd like to stop having the conversation we've been having in pieces for 6 months and just have it. A pause. Yes, he said. I think it's time. She looked out at the silver land. It was nearly September, almost exactly a year since the platform. Almost exactly a year since she'd stepped off a train in Wyoming, believing she was walking toward one thing, and walked instead toward something she couldn't have planned or predicted or deserved or earned. She'd simply walked toward it because there was nowhere else to go, and then stayed because everything else had become less real than this. They got home at dusk the next day, and the ranch came around the bend in the road the way it always did, piece by piece. Fence line, barn, house. And the cattle were where they should be, and the neighbor had managed things well, and the garden was enormous now, late summer abundance. Everything that had been planted in faith through a difficult spring and had come in despite everything. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. The tomatoes got away from me, Gideon said beside her. They're not supposed to get that tall, she agreed. I tied them up like you said. You tied them wrong. I know, he said. I did it wrong and they still grew. She looked at the sprawling, improbable, productive garden that had been a tangle of abandonment a year ago, and she thought about what it took to restore something that had been left to go to ruin. Not dramatic intervention, just patience and attention and the willingness to put your hands in the ground day after day, not knowing what would come of it. She turned to him. Ask me, she said. He looked at her. He understood what she meant. He was not a man who did things dramatically, and he didn't do this dramatically either. He didn't reach for her hands, though she wouldn't have minded. He just looked at her with those dark, direct eyes and said, Evelyn Harper, I'd like you to stay, permanently, as my wife, if you'll have me. Not because you need a place to be, because I want you here, because this ranch is better with you in it, and He stopped, the not quite finishing of things when they mattered most. I'm better. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 31 letters that had been a lie. She thought about a train platform in September and a voice that had said, Are you finished? And feet that had kept walking. She thought about cold mornings and supply order arguments and wood stove compromises and early mornings with coffee and the particular sound of a man working in the barn before the house had woken up, a sound that had become, without her deciding it would, the sound of a day beginning correctly. She thought about choosing freely. Yes, she said. He exhaled, a single, brief exhale, the sound of something held for a long time finally being set down. Yes, she said again, because it was worth saying twice. On the condition that we are clear from the start that I am not Clara, and I am not a replacement for anything, and that I will continue to have opinions about supply orders, and you are allowed to tell me when I've overstepped, and I'll tell you the same. And neither of us is going to pretend to be easier than we are. I know who you are, he said. I'm not looking for easy. Good, she said. Because I'm not. He almost smiled then. The full version of it, the one she'd been getting gradually increasing amounts of over months, and which she privately considered one of the better sights in Wyoming. Almost smiled, and then reached out and put his hand over hers where it rested on the doorframe, warm and rough and steady. They stood like that for a moment, looking at the sprawling garden and the mountains going gold behind it. Neither of them had any idea what September would bring with the arbitration or what Clayton Marsh would do when he heard. There were still things unresolved. There always were. That was the nature of actual life, as opposed to the kind of life she'd once believed she was traveling toward on a westbound train. But the ground under her feet was solid, and she was exactly where she had chosen to be. The arbitration was held on the 12th of September, almost exactly 1 year to the day after Evelyn had stepped off the train at Millhaven Station. She thought about that on the morning they rode to town for it. The specific symmetry of it, the way a year could contain such different versions of the same person. She had been on a train this time last year. She had been holding letters in her lap and smoothing a pressed dress and believing, with the particular faith of someone who had nothing left to lose, that she was traveling towards something real. She had been wrong about the destination, but not, it turned out, about the direction. Gideon drove the wagon. She sat beside him, which was where she always sat now, and the road was dry and the mountains were beginning to show the first changes that came with September. Something in the light, something in the quality of the air that was different from summer without yet being autumn, a threshold feeling, a betweenness that the Wyoming landscape wore differently than Kansas ever had. "You're quiet," he said. "You're always quiet, and I never say anything about it," she said. "You say things about it constantly." "I observe it," she said. "There's a difference." He made the sound that had become, over a year, her favorite sound he made. Not quite a laugh, not quite agreement, something in the range between them that meant she'd landed something and he wasn't going to fully admit it. "Are you nervous?" she asked. He considered the question with the honesty he applied to most things. "Yes," he said. "Not about losing. I don't think we're going to lose. I'm nervous about what Clayton does if we win." She had thought about that too. They both had, in the way you think about something you can't fully control, present at the edges of other thoughts, returning when you weren't looking for it. "We deal with that when it comes," she said. "Yes," he said. "We do." The arbitration room was in the back of the territorial judge's office, which smelled of wood and old paper and the particular institutional gravity of a place where decisions were made. Aldridge was already there when they arrived, his small handwriting spread across several pages of notes, his expression that of a man who was prepared and knew he was prepared and was managing the particular calm of someone who had done this many times before. Clayton was there too. She hadn't seen him since April. In the months between the confrontation on the ranch road and now, he had existed only as a legal document, a rumor, a recurring anxiety. Seeing him in person was different. He looked, not diminished exactly, because he was still a physically imposing man, still had the easy posture of someone accustomed to rooms working in his favor. But something around his edges was different, tighter. A man who had been pursuing something for a year and had not caught it, and was beginning to feel, on some level he probably hadn't fully acknowledged, the cost of the pursuit. He looked at her when she came in. She held his gaze for exactly as long as necessary to communicate that she was not afraid, and then she looked at Aldridge and said, "Are we ready?" "We are," Aldridge said. The arbitrator was a retired territorial judge named Foss, who had white hair and a manner that suggested he had seen every variety of land dispute and human foolishness that Wyoming had to offer and was not easily impressed by any of it. He read both claims with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who understood that speed was the enemy of accuracy, and then he asked questions of both lawyers in the clipped, precise way of someone who already had a direction in mind and was testing whether it would hold. Clayton's lawyer was younger than Aldridge and more aggressive in a way that filled space without necessarily filling it with substance. He presented the ambiguities in the survey map with considerable theatrical energy, drawing the arbitrator's attention to each uncertain landmark. building a case that was genuinely skillful if you accepted the map as the primary document. Aldridge let him finish. Then he presented the letter. He did it without drama, which was itself a kind of drama, setting the document on the table and reading the relevant section aloud in his dry, precise voice. The surveyor's own words placing the eastern boundary exactly where Gideon's fence had always stood. He then produced 2 additional documents he had located in the weeks since Cheyenne. A tax record from 8 years prior, in which the Blackwood property had been assessed with the eastern section included, signed by the same territorial office that had authorized the original grant, and a letter from the original marshland purchase, written by Clayton's own father, in which the elder Marsh had explicitly acknowledged the Blackwood eastern line as the boundary between their properties. Clayton's lawyer objected to the introduction of the 3rd document. Judge Foss looked at him over his spectacles and said, in the tone of a man who had been objected to by considerably more formidable lawyers, overruled. It's in the record. The rest was not quick. These things were never quick, and she'd known it wouldn't be, and she sat through 2 hours of argument and counter-argument with the patience she'd been building all year in gardens and early mornings, and conversations that required waiting for the right moment to say the right thing. Gideon sat beside her with his hands flat on the table and his expression contained, giving nothing away, watching Aldridge work. She watched Clayton. This was useful, she'd found, watching the thing you were afraid of clearly rather than looking away from it. Clayton's lawyer became less confident through the 2nd hour. Small signs, the increased frequency with which he consulted his notes, the slight change in his vocal pace when Aldridge's counter-arguments landed. Clayton himself sat very still in a way that was different from Gideon's stillness. Gideon was still because he was conserving himself. Clayton was still because he was managing the emerging shape of something he hadn't prepared for. Judge Foss took 30 minutes. He came back with a single sheet of paper and read his finding in the flat, conclusive voice of someone accustomed to having the last word. The eastern boundary of the Blackwood property would remain where it had been surveyed, assessed, and acknowledged for 8 years. The Marsh claim was dismissed. Court costs would be divided equally. That was all. Clayton's lawyer began to say something. Foss looked at him. He stopped. In the silence that followed, Evelyn looked at Gideon. He was looking at the table, and she could see him absorbing it, the finding, the finality of it, the specific relief of a man who had been holding something at bay for months and could finally put it down. He wasn't triumphant. She hadn't expected him to be. He was just relieved. Deeply, quietly relieved in the way of someone for whom the ranch was not a financial asset, but a life's work, and a place where grief and love and 14 years of daily labor had become indistinguishable from each other. She put her hand over his on the table. He turned his hand over and held hers. On the other side of the room, Clayton Marsh stood up and buttoned his coat and walked out without speaking to anyone. His lawyer followed, carrying his papers with the particular efficiency of a man who wanted to be elsewhere. Aldridge looked at Evelyn and Gideon with what passed in his measured face for satisfaction. "Well," he said. "Well," Evelyn agreed. Outside, the September air was doing the exact thing it had been doing on the wagon ride in that threshold quality, that sense of a year turning on its axis. She stood on the steps of the territorial office and breathed it in. The town of Mill Haven went on around her, wagons on the road, a woman calling to a child, the distant sound of the smithy. A year ago, she had walked through this town for the first time with her trunk and her bag and her $4, following a man she didn't know, feeling the looks of people who had just witnessed her humiliation. She walked through it now as someone who had broken a fence post free from ground that hadn't wanted to give it up, who had argued about January and won on the flower, who had stood on a porch with a shotgun and said, "This isn't yours to take," who had looked at a man she trusted and said yes, knowing what she was saying. She was not the same person. She was not a better version of the same person, which was the clean and tidy way of telling that story. She was a different person, made from the same materials but rearranged by a year that had required her to find out which of her qualities were real and which had only been serviceable, which of her beliefs about herself held under pressure and which had dissolved. The rearrangement was not comfortable. It had cost things. But she was, at 36, no, she was still 26, she corrected herself. She always felt older than she was. She was real in a way she had not been a year ago. They married in October. Not in a church, The nearest one was 20 miles away, and neither of them felt the ceremony required institutional endorsement. They married in the yard between the house and the garden, on a morning that was cold and clear and smelled of the turned earth she'd been working the day before. Mrs. Olson stood with them as witness, which was correct, and the Hargrove brothers came, and Ruth Calloway came with her mother, and Judge Foss had agreed, when Gideon had asked him in the hallway after the arbitration, to ride out and make it legal, which the old man had done with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to everything. It was not a beautiful ceremony in the way ceremonies in stories were described as beautiful. It was cold, and someone's horse was being difficult near the barn, and Evelyn had been up since before dawn because she couldn't sleep, and her hair was not doing what she wanted it to do, and she gave up on it halfway through and just braided it, which was not what she'd planned, but was what happened. She wore the dress she'd pressed with lavender soap a year ago, which still fit and had been carefully maintained, and which she wore now not because it was her best dress. It wasn't, she'd made better since, but because it seemed right to close that particular circle. Gideon wore the cleanest shirt he owned and his second-best hat, which Mrs. Olson had told him firmly was insufficient, and he had said was sufficient, and they had argued about it for 5 minutes while Evelyn listened from the bedroom and felt, with the specific warmth of something real, that this was what her life was now, and it was good. Judge Foss said the words, which were simple. Gideon said the words back, which were also simple. Evelyn said them, and she meant them with the full weight of everything they contained. Promise and uncertainty, and the specific knowledge that she was choosing this with clear eyes, that she was not running towards something or away from something, but was simply standing in her own life and saying yes, this, here, with this man, as long as it lasts. Mrs. Olson made a sound. "Are you crying?" Gideon asked her, with the mildest possible alarm. "No," said Mrs. Olson, who clearly was. "You are," he said. "I have something in my eye," she said. "Both of them?" Evelyn asked. "Don't," said Mrs. Olson, pointing at her, but she was smiling underneath it. The years that came after were not easy years. She would have been suspicious of easy years by then. She'd learned that ease, when it came, was something you received without expecting it to be permanent, and that the expectation of permanence was the thing that made its absence unbearable. So she received the good years when they came and worked through the hard ones and tried not to confuse either for the whole story. The ranch grew slowly, not dramatically. They were not dramatic people, and the frontier did not reward dramatic plans without a foundation of daily work to support them. Gideon expanded the cattle operation over 3 years, adding acreage to the south when the Whitmore family moved on, and left land available at a price they could manage. She expanded the kitchen garden into a proper market garden. The second summer, selling produce to the town and to the Calloway household, and eventually to the boarding house that had been Mill Haven's only accommodations when she arrived, and that was, by the time their first child was born, one of 3. The child was a boy. They named him Daniel, which had been Evelyn's father's name, and Gideon did not suggest it, she did, but he agreed immediately in the way he agreed to things that were right. Daniel arrived in the 2nd year of their marriage, in a February snowstorm, 3 weeks early and considerably more vocal than either of his parents, which Mrs. Olson said was justice. "He's already arguing," she said, holding him on his 2nd day, with the expression of a woman who had waited for this specifically and was not going to pretend she hadn't. "He comes by it naturally," Gideon said, and did not look at Evelyn when he said it. "From which side?" Evelyn asked. "Both," he said, and that time she could not argue with him. A daughter came 3 years after that, Margaret, who had Gideon's dark eyes and Evelyn's stubbornness, which was a combination that would cause them considerable excitement as she grew. The children changed the texture of the ranch in the way children always did, made it louder, made it more complicated, made certain things that had been private and careful between 2 adults who'd had to learn each other slowly into something that happened around and through and despite small people with urgent needs and no patience for adult emotional navigation. It was not smooth. There were periods of exhaustion so complete she couldn't remember what she'd thought about before children, and periods of disagreement that had to be had quietly after bedtime, and a span of months in the 4th year when Daniel was sick, and the doctor came out twice, and both of them were frightened in the particular way that fear for a child was different from any other fear, total and irrational, and not responsive to the kind of steady management they'd each learned to apply to other varieties of difficulty. Daniel recovered. He recovered and went back to being Daniel, which was itself exhausting in a different way, and she sat on the porch one evening after he was in bed and breathed the October air and felt the specific gratitude of someone who had been prepared to lose something and hadn't. Gideon sat beside her. He'd come out quietly, the way he moved through all spaces. "He's all right," she said. "He is," he agreed. They sat with that for a while. "Gideon," she said. "I want you to know," she started and stopped and started again. "I think about that platform sometimes. Still. Less often than I used to, but I think about it. And I think about what would have happened if any single thing had been different, if you hadn't been there, if you'd been the kind of man who watched and didn't move." She stopped. "I think about it because I want to know that I know it, that I understand what was given to me that day. Not just shelter, not just the practical things, but the chance to find out who I was going to be here." He was quiet for a long moment. "I think about it too," he said. "Different version. I think about what I would have done if I'd watched you walk away with no one having said anything. What that would have cost. What do you think it would have cost?" He looked at the mountains, which were doing what they did in October, something with the light that was neither summer nor winter, pure threshold, pure between. "Everything," he said simply. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her without performance or ceremony, the way he did everything, because it was the right thing at the right moment, not because he was demonstrating it to anyone. Clayton Marsh came back once more. She had not thought about him in nearly 2 years when she heard his name again, in the spring of what would have been his 5th year, said by Ruth Calloway with a particular care that people used when delivering news they weren't sure how to frame. He had come back to Millhaven briefly, Ruth said, passing through. He had not come out to the ranch. He had not caused any trouble, that seemed, from Ruth's account, to have left him, the appetite for it, the way energy for certain things could be spent entirely by the consequences of pursuing them. His family money was apparently considerably reduced through a combination of bad investment and the costs of the previous year's legal actions, and Ruth thought some additional difficulties she didn't have the specifics of. He had looked, Ruth said carefully, like a man who had been smaller than he'd believed himself to be, and was beginning to understand that. Evelyn thought about this for a day or so. Not with anger. She'd expected anger to be what she felt when she thought about him, for a long time, but the anger had gone somewhere else over the years, had metabolized into something less sharp. What she felt instead was something closer to the feeling you had when you looked at a scar that had fully healed, awareness of what it had been, acknowledgement of what it had cost, and then the return of your attention to the things in front of you. She told Gideon that evening. He listened without interrupting. "Are you all right?" he asked when she'd finished. "I'm fine," she said. And then, more honestly, "I feel... I don't know exactly. Not glad he's struggling. Not sorry either. Just distant from it, like it belongs to someone else's life." "It does," he said. "Mostly." "Mostly," she agreed. She thought about what Ruth had said, about the look of a man who was smaller than he'd believed. She thought about the letters, which she had finally burned in the wood stove on a winter evening in their first married year, not dramatically but deliberately, feeding them one at a time because that was the appropriate pace for the ending of a story. She thought about what it meant that a man could have an entire other person's life in his hands, not through any legitimate claim, not through love or work or commitment, but simply through the power of written words offered in bad faith, and could throw that life away for $10 and an audience's laugh and never once understand what he was throwing. He had not become a better man. That was the thing she kept returning to in the quiet of the years that followed. Not as judgment. She had no particular interest in judging Clayton Marsh. He was not interesting enough to judge. But as information, as the thing the story had been trying to tell her from the beginning, if she'd been ready to hear it. That character was not what a person said about themselves. It was not what they wrote in letters or promised over supper or performed for an audience that they needed to impress. Character was what they did when they could have done otherwise. It was the moment on the platform when a man could have walked away from someone else's humiliation and didn't. It was the winter of supply order arguments and cold mornings and ledger books and no audience at all. It was every unglamorous Tuesday of a life built with another person through all the ordinary difficulty that love in the actual world required. Clayton Marsh had been given the opportunity, on a station platform, to become a better man. He had used it to become himself, more completely and finally, and had spent years paying the cost of that choice, in the particular currency of a person who had made themselves too small to grow into anything else. She did not think about him after that in any sustained way. He passed out of Millhaven in the spring, and she did not hear his name again for a very long time. And when she did, it was the kind of mention that had no heat in it. Someone saying he'd gone to Colorado, someone else saying they'd heard he'd married, a third person who couldn't remember exactly which Marsh they were thinking of. He became eventually the kind of man who was difficult to remember precisely. She became, in the same span of years, the kind of woman who was difficult to forget. Not through intention. She had not come to Wyoming to become anything in particular, had arrived with the aim of simply surviving what had happened to her and finding some kind of next. But the valley had its own logic, and the work she'd put into it had its own logic, and people remembered specific things. The woman who had stood on a porch with a shotgun and told a mounted man that nothing here was his to take. The market garden that had grown from a neglected plot into something that supplied half the town through its summer abundance. The Tuesday afternoons she'd begun, in the third year, to host at the ranch for women who were new to the territory and uncertain of their footing. Not a formal arrangement, nothing with a name, just coffee and the kind of practical information that no one gave you when you arrived. Where the reliable doctor was, which supplier gave honest credit, how to file a property record correctly, who in town would help, and who would watch and do nothing. Ruth Calloway had been the first to come. Then a widow from the east side of the valley who was managing a homestead claim alone and needed to know whether she was doing it correctly. Then two sisters who had come together from Missouri and were sharper than anyone had expected and needed only to be pointed in the right direction. Evelyn pointed people in the right direction. She had learned, through a particular and difficult education, how to distinguish between someone who needed rescue and someone who needed information, and she was considerably better at providing the second than the first. She did not save people. She gave them what she had: knowledge of this place, understanding of how its systems worked, the specific credibility that came from being the woman who had arrived on a train platform with nothing and built something from it. Mrs. Olson called it a ministry once, in her direct way, and Evelyn said she would thank her not to use words like that, and Mrs. Olson said she would say what she meant regardless, and they argued about it for 10 minutes, which was their way. And then Mrs. Olson stayed for supper, which was also their way. Gideon watched all of it, the Tuesday afternoons, the women who came through, the gradual way the ranch had become something more than the sum of its practical functions. With the quiet attention he brought to everything, he never interfered, never suggested, never tried to manage what she was doing. Occasionally he made the coffee before she had a chance to, which was a form of participation that suited him precisely. "You're doing something important," he told her once. In the plain-spoken way he offered assessments of important things. "I'm having people over for coffee," she said. "You're telling women who are frightened that the ground holds," he said. "That's important." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the directness she had never stopped finding slightly startling, even after years. "You're the one who told me the ground held," she said, "that first day. Hey, I gave you a room," he said. "You told yourself the rest." She thought about that for a while after. Whether he was right. She thought he was, mostly. Not because he hadn't mattered. He had mattered enormously. He was one of the fixed points her life had oriented around. But because the thing that had held on that platform, the thing that had said, "Are you finished?" and walked away and kept walking, that thing had been hers. She had brought it from Kansas. It had been made from her father's steadiness and her mother's endurance and 3 years of running a farm alone and whatever quality of character she'd been born with that she had never been able to see clearly because she'd spent too long letting other people define what it was. She had come west looking for a man to build a life with. She had found one. But first she had found herself, the version that didn't need to be rescued, that didn't need to be claimed, that could stand on a porch in April with a shotgun and speak plainly about what was hers and what was not. That version had been there all along. The train platform had simply made it visible. On a September evening in what she calculated was the 8th year since she'd arrived, she sat on the porch after supper while the light did what September light did over the valley. That long gold slant that made even ordinary things look deliberate. And she watched her children in the yard. Daniel was 9 by then, argumentative and curious, and better with the cattle already than she'd been at twice his age. And Margaret was 6 and had recently developed strong opinions about the market garden that were mostly wrong but showed promise. They were arguing about something that was probably not important, in the total commitment way of children for whom nothing was unimportant. Gideon came out and sat beside her. They watched the children argue. "Margaret's right," Evelyn said. "She's not," Gideon said. "She's confident, which isn't the same thing." "I was confident at 6. "Yes," he said. "You were also right more often than was strictly comfortable." She looked at the mountains. 8 years of looking at them, and they still occasionally stopped her. Not with the theoretical awe of the first night, but with something more familiar and more true. The way you felt about a landscape you had worked in and loved and understood to be indifferent to you, in the way that all large things were indifferent, and that indifference was not unkind. "Are you happy?" she asked. She asked him this sometimes, not from anxiety but from genuine curiosity, because he was a man whose inner weather was not always visible, and she had learned to ask rather than assume. He considered the question with his characteristic honesty. "Yes," he said, "most of the time. Some of the time I'm worried about the south pasture or the price of feed or whether Daniel's cough is turning into something. But underneath that—" He paused, and she waited, knowing the pause. "Yes, I'm happy." "Good," she said. "Are you?" She looked at the yard where Margaret had apparently won the argument by the simple method of walking away from it, which was a strategy Evelyn recognized, and Daniel was following her with the specific frustration of someone who wanted to keep going and had been deprived of the opportunity. She thought about a morning in September 8 years ago, on a train, with pressed lavender soap and 31 letters and $4 and nothing at all to go back to. She thought about what she had believed she was traveling toward and what she had been traveling toward, which were not the same thing, and which had required her to lose one entirely before she could find the other. She thought about the things a person carried, not the letters, which were ash, not the humiliation, which had become information, not the fear, which had become a kind of compass, but the actual things, the ones you didn't choose, the ones that were simply part of what you were made of, the steadiness and the stubbornness and the particular quality of will that said keep walking when the ground under you had just dissolved. Those things had brought her here, not here as a destination she'd planned, here as the result of walking forward through every version of here that had come before. The station platform, the cold room with the mountain view, the supply order argument, the shotgun on the porch, the lawyer's office table, the judge's single sheet of paper, the October morning in the yard between the house and the garden. Every version of here stacked underneath this one, holding it up. "Yes," she said, "I'm happy." The children came in from the yard loud and in need of supper, and the evening closed in around them all, warm, imperfect, real. And the mountains went purple in the last light, and then dark, and the stars came out in the quantity you could only see in places dark enough to show them. And somewhere in the house a child asked a question that required answering, and she got up and went inside. And that was the evening, and it was enough, and it was hers. There is a thing that people sometimes say when they mean to comfort someone who has been badly hurt by another person's cruelty, that it was meant to happen, that it led somewhere good, and therefore the pain was worth it, that suffering has a plan. She had never believed that, not even at her most hopeful. The platform had not been meant to happen. Clayton Marsh's cruelty had not been a gift in disguise. What had happened to her on that platform was simply what it was, ugly and unjust and not redeemed by what followed, because suffering did not require redemption to be real. What followed had followed because she had kept walking, because one man had done a small and costly thing, and another man had done a small and decent one, and she had been clear-eyed enough, even in the worst moment of her life, to recognize the difference. That was the thing worth knowing, she thought, in the years that taught her enough to think it clearly. Not that cruelty leads somewhere good, but that it doesn't have to lead anywhere at all. That you could take the worst thing that ever happened to you and refuse to let it be the thing that defined the direction of your life. That the ground held under people who were willing to keep standing on it. That character, real character, the kind worth having, was never visible in the grand moments, only in the ordinary ones. The repeated daily choice to be exactly who you said you were, with no audience watching and nothing to gain from it. She had learned that from a man who hadn't filled a single page with beautiful words and had not needed to. She had learned it from herself, too. and that in the end was the whole of the story. Not a triumph, not a perfect arc, not the kind of ending where all debts are settled and all light is golden. Just a woman who had arrived at a train station with nothing and had found out, through the specific education of a hard year, what she was actually made of. It was enough.